please call the roll.
Ms. Williams.
Here.
Mr. Jacobson.
Here.
Ms. Carter. Ms. Wilson-Phelan. Ms. Wilson-Phelan. Ms. Wattenberg. Ms. Woodruff.
Here.
Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones. Mr. Whedon.
Present.
Mr. Batchelor. Mr. Batchelor. Ms. Hall. Ms. Hall. Mr. DeRosen. Mr. DeRosen. Madam President, you have a quorum.
A quorum has been determined, and the State Board of Education will proceed now with the business portion of the meeting. Members, we have a draft agenda before us. I would like a unanimous consent to remove the approval of the minutes and to add it to our March 22nd public meeting. Any objections? No objections? Are there any additional corrections or additions? Seeing no additional changes, I would entertain a motion to approve the agenda.
So moved.
Is there a second? Now that the motion has been properly moved and seconded, I will ask for the yeas and nays. All in favor, say yea.
Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Thank you. The motion is approved. Members, our colleague from Ward 5, Mark Jones, has asked to participate in the votes tonight by phone. This requires an affirmative vote of the board. I would ask for a unanimous consent to allow Mr. Jones' participation. Is there an objection? Seeing none, the motion is approved. Good evening. My name is Karen Williams, Ward 7 Representative and President of the State Board of Education. On behalf of the members of the District of Columbia State Board of Education, I want to welcome our guests and our viewing public to our Wednesday, March 15th public meeting. The State Board typically holds its regularly scheduled meetings on the third Wednesday of every month in the Old Council Chambers at 441 4th Street Northwest. Tonight, the State Board will consider 3 important resolutions: new physical education standards, new residency regulations, and a resolution affirming confirming the State Board's commitment to the protection of all of our students. I want to commend Vice President Jack Jacobson for bringing this resolution before us. In a few minutes, I will ask him to speak about the resolution. Tonight, the State Board will give final approval to the new residency regulations that will ease the burden on parents, but also streamline the investigatory and review process. I want to thank Superintendent Kang, but she's not here right now, and her team for their dedication to finding the right balance in the final regulations. We will also vote on the approval of new physical education standards. These new standards will help students develop motor skills, knowledge, and behaviors for a lifetime of healthy living. Physical education is vital to a well-rounded education, and I am glad to see the commitment of Donna Anthony, Assistant Superintendent of Health and Wellness, and her team to the health of our students. The State Board will also continue its work tonight related to the Every Student Succeeds Act. We will be hearing from the public their comments on the revised statewide accountability plan that OSSE issued yesterday. The superintendent and her team walked the SBOE through the changes in our working session yesterday. I am pleased to see that many of the recommendations made by the public and by the State Board of Education on the draft plan have been included in the final draft. The final plan includes greater weight on growth, a measure that I believe will help focus our schools on every student rather than just those at the top. The final plan also includes specifics on how we will be including metrics related to well-rounded education and school climate. The superintendent and her team partnered with the SBOE to hold meetings across the district last month. It is clear they listened, and I want to thank them for doing so. In a few minutes, I will ask the superintendent to walk through the final plan so that everyone is clear on what it includes and what it does not. There is a lot in the plan we can be proud of. It may not be perfect, but RC has included a method to continued review and adjustment to ensure we are getting the information we need. Before we move to our resolutions, I'd like to invite, are you going to speak for us? I'd like to invite Shauna, she is not our state superintendent, Shauna Young, to speak, to make remarks.
Good evening, thank you. My name is Shauna Young. I'm the Chief of Staff at OSSI. The superintendent was speaking in front of council at a hearing, and she's on her way. But we thank you for allowing us to be here tonight. I know we have a full agenda of both action and comment, and we thank the State Board for your work on the policies here for vote tonight, and also for the collaborative work on ESSA and the robust conversation that you've helped us facilitate across the city. As you said, as the president said, OSSI posted yesterday a document with changes to our state plan, specifically in the areas of accountability. And we thank you for the robust conversation in the working session yesterday, and look forward to the comment today. And the superintendent will speak again when she arrives. Thank you.
Thank you. Members, we have a ceremonial resolution before us. After a motion to consider the resolution, I will ask Mr. Haywood to read it into the record before opening the floor for comments. So can I have a motion to consider the resolution? Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed?
Ceremonial Resolution CR 17-2, protecting and supporting all district students. Whereas the protection of citizens is an essential role of government, whereas it is the right of every student to access a free public pre-kindergarten through 12th grade education, and it is the responsibility of the District of Columbia government to ensure that all students who reside within the district can safely access a free public K-12 education. Whereas the Obama administration recognized that a school's Title IX obligation to ensure non-discrimination on the basis of sex requires schools to provide transgender students equal access to education programs, facilities, and activities, even in circumstances in which other students, parents, or community members raise objections or concerns, and the desire to accommodate others' discomfort cannot justify a policy that singles out and disadvantages a particular class of students. And whereas 95% of the district's public schools, including District of Columbia Public Schools and our public charter schools, are in compliance with the Youth Bullying Prevention Act, which ensures that youth feel safe and supported in their school environments. Therefore, be it resolved that the DC State Board of Education reaffirms its commitment that all students in the district have welcoming, diverse, and inclusive schools. Be it further resolved that the DC State Board of Education applauds District of Columbia Public Schools, the DC Public Charter School Board, and our individual charter schools for their support and protection of all district youth. Be it further resolved that the DC State Board of Education recommends that all public schools and public charter schools develop plans for protecting their students, regardless of their immigration status, from deportation, harassment, inquiry, and other investigation from federal authorities seeking to undermine students' right to a public education. Be it further resolved that the DC State Board of Education recommends that all public schools and public charter schools and all district municipal buildings with 6 or more restrooms designate at least one as an all-gender restroom. Be it further resolved that the State Board of Education hereby directs its Administration and Budget Committee to develop a non-discrimination and equity policy for the State Board to be drafted, reviewed, adopted, and included in the State Board Policy Manual as soon as practicable. And Madam President, may I note that Mr. Jones has joined us by phone.
Thank you. Thank you, Vice President Jacobson, for this resolution. Would you like to comment?
Yeah, I have a comment, and then I have 2 amendments, I believe, that will be friendly amendments, I hope. The change in the administration in the presidential administration has made folks uncomfortable generally in my ward, and folks have reached out to me simply because there's uncertainty. And what this resolution seeks to do is to reaffirm certainty within our jurisdiction over what DC has control over, which include protecting all of our students, particularly our transgender students and our immigrant students. The government has worked very hard to ensure that all students have access to facilities and have access to learning that is uninterrupted, and can ensure that a student can attend school and graduate on time with the skills they need to be successful adults. All of our schools are either in compliance or well on their way to compliance with this, particularly the anti-bullying, which I know that the Department of Suzanne Greenfield is in the Department of Office of Human Rights, has worked very hard to help schools come into compliance with DC laws and regulations, and we've made great strides. One piece that I wanted to point out in particular is DC had a trans survey recently, and 70% of the respondents reported being harassed, threatened, or denied access to bathrooms. This resolution encourages schools to ensure that students have access to facilities that they need and require. With that, I would like to suggest two friendly amendments. One was suggested by Dr. Woodruff, which is in the second whereas at line 10 to simply remove the words K-12, to just say that the district can safely access a free public education and not limit it to K-12. Is that okay with Ms. Wattenberg? Yeah. So that would be a friendly amendment. And the second, then is offered by Laura Wilson Phelan from Ward 1, who can't be here this evening. And I'd like to read that resolution, that amendment into the record. Be it further resolved that the DC State Board of Education recommends that all public schools and public charter schools support transgender students by developing and adopting comprehensive plans that include tools for teachers and administrators, identifying safe and therapeutic spaces, and the use of unbiased language. And I would count that as a friendly amendment if Ms. Wattenberg would as well. I think you moved the resolution. So if no objections, then then the two amendments would be incorporated. And with that, I'd finish my comments.
Would any other member like to comment on the resolution? No? Oh. Members, our colleague from Ward 1, Laura Wilson Phelan, would like to join us on the phone. This requires an affirmative vote of the board. I would ask for unanimous consent to allow Ms. Wilson Phelan to participate. Is there an objection? Seeing none, the motion is approved. Seeing no other discussion, the question is approval of a ceremonial resolution on the sense of the State Board in protecting the rights of all students. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? The motion is approved. Sorry. Residency requirements. The current regulations related to providing residency for education are onerous and burdensome to parents and schools. I am pleased that OSSI has tackled this issue and developed a balanced revision. Is there a motion on the approval of the resolution?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
It's been properly moved and seconded. Mr. Haywood, would you now read the resolution, please?
State Board of Education resolution to approve the promulgation of the proposed residency rulemaking, SR 17-5. Whereas District of Columbia law requires State Board of Education approval of rules for residency verification. Whereas to enroll a student in a District of Columbia public or public charter school, a parent, guardian, or other primary caregiver is required to provide the school with original documents to prove district residency, including the Office of the State Superintendent of Education's residency verification form, supporting documentation as set forth in DC Code 38-309, and other primary caregiver documentation if applicable. Whereas the current regulatory framework for residency verification was last updated in 2008, and the education landscape in the district has changed since then, including the dramatic expansion of pre-K programs. Whereas the current regulatory framework lacks clarity, particularly around the basic definition of residency and for custody situations. Whereas there is an opportunity to improve residency verification by reducing burdensome practices while making sure seats for district schools are first available to district residents. Whereas the state superintendent issued an advance notice of proposed rulemaking on September 8th, 2016, which intended to reduce burdens, lift barriers, and improve clarity for both local education agencies and families in the residency verification process, as well as to ensure a rigorous process that discourages fraud. Whereas the state superintendent solicited feedback on the advance notice of proposed rulemaking during the public comment period open from September 8, 2016 through October 26, 2016, including receiving comments from the public and local education agencies during engagement sessions at the Office of the State Superintendent on September 22nd, October 11th, and October 18th, 2016, and written feedback from various education stakeholders across the district. Whereas the state superintendent thoroughly considered and amended the proposed rule based on the comments received and therefore issued a notice of proposed rulemaking in the DC Register on January 13, 2017 for a 30-day public comment period at 64 DCR 2 that included the following: a two-part test for residency, which includes establishing a physical presence in the district and submission of valid and proper documentation, protections for vulnerable populations, including students experiencing homelessness, undocumented students, adult students, wards of the district, and minor parents, residency determinations in various formal and informal custodial situations, option of efficient and streamlined residency verification for K-12 students that meets the annual submission, the three-part test for when a student's residency may be based on other primary caregivers' residency, authority for OSSI to monitor the residency verification process to offer further protections, guidelines for the enrollment and re-enrollment of non-resident students, detailed requirements around the investigation of a non-resident student, and 2 venues to obtain a final administrative decision on finding of non-residency. Whereas the state superintendent solicited feedback on the notice of proposed rulemaking during the public comment period open from January 13, 2017 through February 13, 2017, and received comments from 1 stakeholder. Whereas the state superintendent adopts the final rules in substantially the same form as proposed, with clarifications and deletions, taking into account suggestions received from the 1 stakeholder's comments. Whereas the state superintendent and members of the State Board of Education have engaged in an extensive period of public engagement, including receiving testimony from the public and from the Office of the State Superintendent of Education regarding the proposed and final residency rules at a public meeting held on October 26, 2016, as well as at working sessions held on October 5th, November 2nd, 2016, and March 1st, 2017. Whereas members of the State Board of Education and public underscored the need for more ways to identify fraud other than through the TIP hotline, reduce burdens for families and local education agencies, and augment protections for homeless, undocumented, and adult students. Whereas the State Board of Education has reviewed the final residency rulemaking and finds that they embody the State Board's commitment to balancing ease of verification with ensuring that district students have first access to seats in district schools. Now therefore be it resolved that the State Board advises that the State Superintendent promulgate final rulemaking substantially the same form as proposed, with minor clarifications and deletions, provided that if substantive changes are made to the final rulemaking, the regulations will require further review and action by the State Board.
Thank you, Mr. Hayworth. Is there a discussion on the resolution? Mr. Whedon?
I'd just like to thank OSSI for their work on this. It's been a hot-button issue in Ward 6 and elsewhere in the city for multiple years. I'd also like to add that our work's not completely done. We need to work with the council to update the DC Code, Section 38-309, to update the documents that can be utilized for verifying residency. I think the regs are good, positive step forward, but we still have one more step to do in conjunction with the council.
Thank you. Any other comments? Ms. Wattenberg?
Yes, so I too want to thank OSSI for all this and hope that the trade-off works in an effort to both ease the burden on parents and assure that spots are used by the right people. I want to say that when I ran for office, my name, as you know, is Ruth Wattenberg, and so my slogan was all R's, and my slogan was rigorous standards, rich curriculum, right-sized testing, research, 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 and reform residency requirements. So I'm very happy to be able to vote for this today, and I am hopeful that we will also deal with the other issues as well tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Wattenberg. Any other comments? Seeing none, the question is approval of a resolution advising the state superintendent to promulgate new residency requirements. I'm sorry. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion is approved. Physical education standards. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, OSSI has proposed updates to our current physical education standards. The proposed changes have come to us after extensive input from experts and district teachers. Tonight, we have a resolution approving the new standards. Is there a motion on approval of the resolution? Motion?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Thank you. The motion has been properly moved and seconded. Sorry, Mr. Haywood, but could you read the resolution into the record, please?
State Board of Education resolution to approve the physical education standards, SR 17-4. Whereas District of Columbia law requires State Board of Education approval and regular review of academic standards. Whereas physical education plays an essential role in developing physically literate students who have the knowledge, skills, and confidence to enjoy a lifetime of healthful physical activity. Whereas the current District of Columbia physical education standards were last revised in 2008. Whereas since 2008, new national standards have been developed that reflect new data, best practices, and changing physical activity trends. Whereas the Office of the State Superintendent of Education's Division of Health and Wellness aligned the proposed physical education standards with the new national physical education standards developed by the Society of Health and Physical Education, physical educators. Whereas the proposed physical education standards were developed by the Office of the State Superintendent of Education after a rigorous drafting process that included significant stakeholder involvement, including from the Healthy Schools Act Commission, the District of Columbia Public Schools, interested District of Columbia Public Charter Schools, the District of Columbia Public Charter School Board, and the general public. Whereas the proposed physical education standards are normed against national best standards and practice, and therefore are informed by current data and emphasize the importance of daily physical activity. Whereas the District of Columbia students and teachers were directly involved in the review of the proposed standards. Whereas the State Board of Education heard testimony on February 15, 2017 regarding the proposed physical education standards. Whereas District of Columbia Public School and Public Charter School students will be assessed on their knowledge of the proposed physical education standards through the Health and Physical Education Assessment. Now therefore be it resolved that on March 15, 2017, the State Board advises that the State Superintendent adopt the physical education standards as proposed in this resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Haywood. Any discussion on the resolution? Seeing none, the question is approval of a resolution advising the state superintendent to adopt new physical education standards. All in favor? Aye.
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 All opposed? The motion has been approved. Every Student Succeeds Act. For over a year, the State Board and OSSI have been soliciting input from the public, national and local experts, students, parents, teachers, and other stakeholders related to the new statewide consolidated plan required by the federal Every Student Succeeds Act. Before we hear from witnesses tonight, I want to thank OSSI for their commitment to working with the State Board of Education and the public through this process. I also want to remind residents that this work does not end tonight or even next week when we vote. Your participation tonight and over the past year is important, and we will encourage you to keep active with us. The State Board welcomes public participation in activities under our authority. At every public meeting, we begin with testimony from public witnesses on education-related matters. If you are a member of the public and would like to speak at a future public meeting, please contact our staff at SBOE@dc.gov or by calling 202-741-0888. Tonight, we have modified our regular practice to further enhance the public's ability to participate in policy. Each of our witnesses will have 3 minutes to speak. After the entire panel speaks, each board member will have 2 minutes to ask any questions they may have of the panel. Due to the number of witnesses we have, I will ask both witnesses and the board members to keep their questions and answers brief. Please note that you must use your microphone. Your microphones are already on if you see a green light. You will also see on your upper right-hand side of the witness table a timer. The light on the timer will be green for the first 2.5 minutes. Will turn yellow for the last 30 seconds, and then will turn red after 3 minutes have lapsed. Our first panel will be Marla Dean, Chantel Fuller, Mark Simon, Samara Gerhardt, and Rebecca Davis.
What do we do with our copies? Give it to you?
If you have copies of your testimony, please give it to Ms. Thank you. We will begin to my left, your right, with Ms. Dean.
Thank you for this opportunity to testify on behalf of the Penn Branch Citizens Civic Association on the DC plan for ESSA. I am Dr. Marla Dean. I have over 25 years as a public school educator. I've served as a former high school English and government teacher for 10 years and a middle high school turnaround central office administrator for over 15 years. Currently, I serve as the Executive Director and CEO of Bright Beginnings, a nonprofit organization that operates early childhood centers for children experiencing homelessness and supports their parents in moving out of their homeless status. I only give my background to emphasize both my longevity and expertise in K-12 education. I want to recognize the SBOE for giving 10 recommendations to OSSI to improve their plan. This rightly acknowledges that the current proposal is woefully insufficient, lacks innovation, and ignores the original intent of ESSA, which was to allow states much more latitude in designing their accountability plans. Unfortunately, the current plan is simply No Child Left Behind 2.0. It is devoid of innovation and it ignores our DC values. The District of Columbia is a progressive citizenry committed to the whole child. That means that we are committed to every child being healthy, safe, engaged, supported, and challenged. The current culture of accountability in the district has heavily relied on high-stakes testing, which has done little to nothing to close the achievement gaps between students living on both sides of the river. The current DC proposed plan doubles down on this mindset of high-stakes testing being the primary vehicle for closing gaps. However, what we know, to close achievement gaps, we must first address opportunity gaps. A whole child approach intentionally addresses issues regarding opportunity gaps. We also know that the current over-reliance on high-stakes testing has created a deficit lens in now how LEAs and schools, teachers, and many students view themselves. In fact, it has dramatically impacted the way many of our students see themselves. Every child is gifted in some area, and no child is gifted in all areas. Yet today's overemphasis and reliance on high-stakes testing has left some children believe they are neither gifted or talented in anything. If we truly are committed to a whole child approach by assuring that every child is healthy, safe, engaged, supported, and challenged, then we must include a broader set of performance indicators to truly assess the effectiveness of a teacher, school, or LEA. I provide 3 recommendations. We have a unique opportunity to reshape education for the next generation. If we focus on a whole child approach by ensuring every child is healthy, safe, engaged, supported, and challenged, then we will close opportunity gaps, which will result in the ending of achievement gaps. Or we can practice the insanity by doubling down on failed policies and practices of the past. I urge you to reject OSCE's DC plan for ESSA. There is no rush to implement another failed accountability plan. Recently, Congress has removed accountability measures for ESSA. In fact, you know as well, the law itself is in flux. Let's spend this time and turn it into an opportunity where we can reimagine educational accountability and lead the nation in progressive policies that engage children and families in their learning, that uses a strength-based approach and is committed to equity for all. Do not implement this plan forcing schools to organize themselves under its mandates when you know it is a failed plan. Do not support this plan by claiming to believe it can be improved in future years. Schools should not be left twisting in the wind. They should operate under some level of certainty. Simply reject the plan, send it back to OSCE with the mandate to sculpt and design the DC plan with our values at its center. Send the message that DC is committed to the whole child. DC is committed to every child being healthy, safe, engaged, supported, and challenged.
Ms. Fuller?
My name is Simona Gerhardt. I've been teaching at Wilson High School for 12 years. I've seen the district go through many changes. Throughout all these transitions, school achievement continues to be a challenge. But thankfully, we now have a wonderful opportunity to change that. Here are 2 indicators that show the need to change DCPS leadership strategy. Indicator number 1, the achievement gap. I'm quoting from the Consolidated State Plan draft. The results of PARC from 2015-2016 showed us that only about 1/4 of DC students were on track for college and career readiness. And there are serious and persistent gaps in outcomes between specific groups of students. Indicator number 2, teacher and principal turnover. Michael Allison Chandler said to Kaya Henderson on the Washington Post, if every year you are replacing 1/3 of your staff, something is wrong. My proposal to change these 2 negative indicators is create an accountability school plan that supports Chancellor Wilson's vision. Chancellor Wilson stated, we want students to thrive. We want to make sure that they are enjoying schools. They should like it. For students to like it, adults have to like it. He also stated, beyond student joy and excitement around school, students must be taught to think critically. Standardized tests do not measure critical thinking. Chancellor Wilson's vision can happen, and I want it to happen, but it can happen only if, 1, OSCE changes the deadline to September 18th to allow Chancellor Wilson time to give feedback. 2, if OSCE reduces the weight on academic achievement and understands that academic achievement is the byproduct of school environment. 3, if our educational leaders learn from the corporate and the military world how to hold people accountable based on the values, vision, and mission of the organization, and also if they learn how to measure an effective school working environment. Our students need an accountability plan that supports and reflects the importance of school environment and supports Chancellor Wilson's vision. Thank you.
Thank you. Nick?
Members of the State Board, my name is Mark Simon, Ward 1 parent, public education advocate, and education policy analyst affiliated with the Economic Policy Institute. You have my written comments focused on your excellent consensus recommendations. I made some suggestions for improvements and would be happy to respond if you have questions about that testimony. But with just 3 minutes, I'd like to focus here on OSCE's response yesterday. and whether it treats your recommendations as seriously as the DC community needs it to. What I appreciated most about your recommendations is that although they are a compromise from what I and most of the dozens of parents, community, and educator representatives wanted, your recommendations still would have brought a shift in emphasis from a single education culture distorting, test-driven metric being the entire focus. You recognize that the learning climate needs to be captured with other significant measures. While OSSE lowered the weight of the test from 80% to 70%, that reduction will not change one iota the test prep emphasis in schools. It will not accomplish what you and we wanted. The slight shift, a good one, towards the growth metric in elementary schools was inexplicably rejected for high schools. While OSSE heard you about the need for a beefed up school climate and well-rounded education, in quotes, component, that was your language and it was good language, they renamed it access and opportunities and reduced the weight from 10% to 5%. That leaves the lion's share of school environment to be measured primarily by attendance and re-enrollment. Attendance hardly captures anything about the quality of the learning culture in a school. While I felt that your recommendations of a climate survey needed to be expanded to include a survey of educators in each school, OSSE has not committed to the concept of using a climate survey at all, but only to exploring the idea for 2 full years. Once you give your approval to their plan now, they are not even committing to allow you to vote on whether it must be included at all in year 3. OSSE's plan revisions seem to have rejected your notion that time on science, social studies, and other subjects not tested by PARCC should be measured at all. In summary, your attempt to get at the richness of the learning culture in each school has been rejected. They seem to have heard you, but in failing to commit to having any factors other than the PARCC test and attendance count significantly, they have rejected your underlying logic. I urge you not to rush to endorse OSSE's plan, even with their revisions, but rather to insist that in order to get your vote of approval, at the very least, they need to take a little more time and consider more seriously your, and through you, our perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you.
Greetings, SBOE representatives, community members, and educators. I'm speaking today on behalf of the students who aren't able to advocate for themselves, the students who are nonverbal, illiterate, and who have trouble completing the most basic day-to-day functioning that many of us take for granted. I am also speaking for the students who have unmet social-emotional needs. I teach 6th through 8th grade students with autism, ADHD, and intellectual disabilities. These are students who are unable to take standardized assessments, but are still required to, based on the demands of OSSE. When I think about the proposed total of 70% of a school's accountability being standardized test scores, I cannot help but think about the inequities that this will encourage, which also would include a culture of fraud and cheating on the assessments in order to meet qualifications. My students, like many students around the district, do not get their most basic needs met at home, and we spend the bulk of the day taking care of socio-emotional concerns and issues which often impede learning. On any given day, we are making calls to CFSA, bringing in clothes for students who do not have access to clean uniforms, feeding them, and advocating for them when central office attempts to violate their rights, all in an effort to make money. To make matters worse, our school shares a school psychologist with 2 other schools, and our social worker is overburdened with over 100 students on her caseload. And those are just the ones who have been identified. Nevertheless, my wonderful staff and I press on and become whomever we need to be in order to make sure our students can be the best versions of themselves. Standardized testing and penalizing schools who do not meet these lofty and unfounded requirements negate the work that we as special educators do daily, and it shows us who OSSE is really looking out for, which is their bottom line, especially when the Smarter Balanced Assessment is more efficient and informative of student achievement. I can go on and on about the conspiracy theories regarding how much money Pearson is making off of our students at their expense, but we'll save that for another hearing. I find it both unethical and immoral that an assessment that has been proven to be largely ineffective is given the credibility to track our students and slap a number on them, determining how successful they will be. What's more is that we have several children in our school significantly below grade level who must take the PARCC when they don't even understand the materials or the assessment itself. OSSE just denied a student of mine eligibility on the alternate assessment when he is 7 years below grade level, so he now has to take the PARCC assessment. For the students taking the alternate assessment, some of them aren't even able to be assessed, but I as a teacher must waste our time and insult their intelligence by forcing them to complete a test that they cannot access. What message are we sending to our children when we will invest in an assessment that is incompetent, but not in social workers, therapists, and other resources that would allow them to better perform on said assessments? We must stop putting profits over children and fulfill the obligation of educating them by making sure that they will be productive members of society. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. Good evening. Members of the State Board of Education, my name is Rebecca Davis. I'm here representing the District of Columbia Environmental Education Consortium. For the first time, the Every Student Act includes language making environmental education and environmental literacy programs explicitly eligible for federal funds, specifically in two formula grant programs described in Title IV of the bill: the Well-Rounded Education Opportunities and the 21st Century Community Learning Centers. And yet, although our elected officials have acknowledged the importance of environmental education in various signed policies, such as the Healthy Schools Act and Sustainable DC Plan, there is no mention of environmental education in the 117 pages of the DCSBOE State Education Plan that is being submitted for public comment. Research indicates that students engage in environmental education experience numerous benefits, including greater pride and ownership in their community, strengthened sense of empowerment to make a difference in their community, better performance and standardized measures of academic achievement in reading, writing, math, science, and social studies. Moreover, environmental education embodies 21st century skills by developing learners' ability to ask questions, speculate and hypothesize about the world around them, connect to the places where they live, seek information and develop answers to their question. Learners engage in inquiry, master fundamental skills of gathering and organizing information, interpret and synthesize information to develop and communicate explanation and invent solution. The District of Columbia has demonstrated a commitment to the importance of environmental education by signing the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement in 2014, which has a number of environmental literacy goals, as well as by signing the Healthy Schools Act of 2010 and the Sustainable DC Omnibus Amendment Act of 2014. The DC Council also demonstrated a commitment to environmental education by mandating DC agencies to develop an environmental literacy plan and to hire an environmental education coordinator at OSSE to support the ELP's implementation. While OSSE has some funding to build its new environmental literacy program, funds from ESSA could be leveraged to reach even more schools to provide environmental education experiences. The District of Columbia Environmental Education Consortium is a strong network of partners and providers that share a strong commitment to environmental education and support this effort. Our members include many local and regional providers such as Clean Air Partners, the Anacostia Watershed Society, Washington Youth Garden, etc. Members of the District of Columbia Environmental Education Consortium provide high-quality environmental education programs to district school and support science using outdoors as a place for inquiry. But to have a robust community of environmental education providers, funds need to be secure. With Title IV of the ESA, the District of Columbia has the opportunity to substantially increase its financial support of environmental education through the following two formula grant programs: the Well-Rounded Education Opportunities and the 21st Century Community Learning Centers. Thank you.
Thank you. Board members, are there any questions of these panel? Mr. Whedon?
So I'd just like to say thank you. I don't think I really have a question. I am a little interested in the testing around the students with disabilities and ensuring that we get that right. I'm not sure I have a succinct question that we can cover in just a minute. But I do want to say thank you for your time and all the input. I think all of us really want to hear the diverse opinions that are out there still on this proposal as we move towards a vote in the next week or two. So thank you.
Thank you very much, and let me say I'm very sympathetic to the point of view that this proposal does not go far enough to break from the test-driven path. As I said, I ran on the platform of right-sized testing, and I think testing is super important, transparency is super important, accountability is super important, but that doesn't mean it should be 80% like the last proposal, or 74%, which is really what it is in years 1 and 2, or 70% in year 3. What I want to ask Simona Gerhardt. I believe you're a parent at Wilson High School.
I know, I'm a teacher.
You're a teacher at Wilson High School. So could you talk to me about the sort of the balance in terms of the effect of the testing, the effect that you think the lack of a growth factor will have at a high school like Wilson, and sort of the reliance on the testing as opposed to the climate and the broader issues?
Yeah, as a teacher, I've been teaching Italian and French for 12 years. I see how the students are impacted by this culture. That's why, especially at Wilson, we are trying to create a school environment where what's important is working hard, think critically, and not being so grade-driven. So this culture from the top down that testing is so important is impacting the culture of our school, and is making the students very passive, because what they care is really just the grade and not the passion for learning. And as Chancellor Wilson said, to make the students think critically. So if we change the pressure from the top for us as teachers, the students will benefit that. And we'll not just talk about grading. Did you put my grade in? This is the only conversation that recently I had with my students. Is no, I don't see the curiosity. I don't see the passion. It's just, did you put the grade in?
Thank you. My 2 minutes is up.
Any other questions? If not, thank you, panel. Thank you all for coming out to testify. The next panel is Gary Ratner, Dexter Williams, Sandra Moscato, Sarah Stone, and Nadia Moritz. Suzanne Wells. Is Danica in the audience? Yeah. And Sarah Moore Curry.
I don't know.
Mr. Radner?
Thank you. My name is Gary Ratner. I'm the Executive Director of Citizens for Effective Schools, CES. CES would like to commend the State Board for having submitted excellent recommendations to the Office of the State Superintendent of Education for revising OSSE's January 30th draft state plan. While OSSE's March 14th summary and responses moved somewhat in the board's direction, OSSE's current positions disregard many of the board's recommendations. I'd like to briefly address 3 issues. First, although stakeholders have widely urged that the weight of test scores for ESSA accountability be greatly reduced and weight be given to school climate, OSSE's response does not do so. Merely reducing the weight for test scores from 80% to 70% for elementary and middle schools, as OSSE proposes, would continue to incentivize schools to put huge emphasis on drill and kill test preparation, testing, and narrowing the curriculum, rather than changing expectations, beliefs, and practices which low-achieving schools need to do to improve. The total weight for test scores, including ELL proficiency, should be reduced to the lowest level statutorily allowed, about 55%. Second, while it's positive that OSSE reaffirmed its previous commitment to conduct a pilot survey of school climate for ultimate accountability purposes, OSSE's response still fails to provide key specifics. These include what weight will be given to the school climate indicator, how will stakeholders be involved in selecting and evaluating the school climate pilot and accountability surveys, what criteria will be used for selection, and what is the timetable. The state plan should give school climate at least 25% of the weight for accountability once the survey is implemented. OSSE should commit to create an advisory task force of key DCPS and charter school stakeholder organizations. With SBOE, that task force should review existing school climate surveys, already found to be valid and reliable by the U.S. Department of Education, as listed in the School Climate Survey Compendium. The task force should determine which surveys would be best for accountability, school improvement, and parental choice in DC's public schools. OSSE should specify that the task force would report its recommendations by fall 2017. The pilot survey would be conducted in 2017-18, its results reviewed by the task force, and a school climate survey be implemented for accountability in 2018-19. Third, while OSSE has agreed to reduce the weight of proficiency from 40% to 30%, as the board recognized, this is still too much weight toward proficiency and too little for growth. In addition to reducing the total weight for test scores, as discussed above, the ratio of proficiency to growth should be reduced to 1 to 4, or at a minimum, as SBOE recognized, to 40/60, a ratio of 2 to 3. Otherwise, schools serving high concentrations of disadvantaged students would be unfairly penalized, and those serving higher income families unfairly benefited. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Sarah Moore-Karai, and I'm a parent of a pre-K-3 child at Capitol Hill Montessori at Logan School. I care deeply about the quality of my daughter's education and the need to understand the quality of our schools based on more than just a test score. I was excited and hopeful at the opportunity to create a new accountability system that will value test scores alongside other important ways of demonstrating school quality and environment. I read the draft plan and attended an OSSE outreach session hosted by the Capitol Hill Public School Parent Organization. I was pleased to hear and to see the deep interest in a new accountability system that looked at the whole child, shared by all of the parents who were in attendance. At the meeting, I was concerned by OSSE's seeming lack of motivation to make significant changes and to allow more time to think critically about these issues as a broad community. Later, I was pleased when the State Board of Education released a list of well thought out and meaningful recommendations for changes to the draft ESSA plan. The recommended changes are greatly supported by my community, including teachers and parents. The recommendations also demonstrated that members of the State Board actually listened to the feedback from the community. My community has hoped that the state board would not approve an OSSI plan that does not implement those changes in full. However, only yesterday, OSSI released its response to public and state board comments. This left us once again with precious little time to review and understand the response and its impact before today's hearing. As I understand it, the plan takes some meaningful steps in addressing the state board's comments, as well as parent and educator input, but it does not nearly go all the way. Is the state board indicating that it generally supports the revised plan as it is? It's disappointing to me and my school community that we are essentially backed into a corner with no additional room for revision or improvement. While I appreciate OSSI's efforts to respond to some of the community input, I still believe we can do better. I hope you will not stop with the plan. I hope that OSSI will continue to work with the parent and educator community every step of the way through implementation. A plan is only as good as an implementation, and the implementation will not be effective without parent and educator partnership. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I'm Donica Petrosius, parent of two at Capitol Hill, Montessori. Viewing your meeting yesterday via Periscope, it appears there is state board support for the revised ESSA plan. I worry this today is a fake hearing. I've been astounded at the disregard for DCPS parent and educator engagement in the ESSA plan process, even though we support 49,000 students every day. OSSI has touted this as great engagement. It held 50 meetings with 100 organizations throughout 2016 before the draft plan went public. Who are those meetings with? 50 charter schools or charter organizations, 34 national education groups, only 10 local education organizations, 4 universities, and 4 DC government agencies, including DCPS. This is a very unbalanced outreach plan where 84% of input came from charters and national organizations that have no understanding of how DCPS schools operate and what the needs of our students are. OSSI did hold one public meeting in each ward in June 2016. I can't take that seriously. Anyone that truly wants to engage parents and teachers does not do so at the end of school and summer when communications with schools and parents is difficult. Let's face it, the DCPS parent and educator community did not help create this draft. After those 2016 meetings, parents and educators did not see the draft plan until January 30th this year. We had 1 month to give input on a plan that will affect our children's education for the next 10 years. Now again, we are being treated as expendable in this process. The revised draft came out only yesterday, yet we have to testify on its merits in 24 hours. Parents appreciated the state board recommendations to improve the ESSA plan. Yesterday's revised draft plan includes some improvements, and it's clear our advocacy helped. But it was not without a massive effort by us to overcome the reluctance of OSSI to change. OSSI is not elected and so has less stake in our voice, but the state board is elected and has power to say, wait, we can do better. Please stop saying September is too late. 30 states are waiting until September to submit their plans, and they too will collect data in 17, 18, just like DC. We could wait and build a better plan with deep buy-in, but OSSI says they won't. I urge you, our elected body, to vote no on the plan. Based on yesterday's swift, seemingly pre-baked support of the tweaked OSSI plan, it seems many of you have already decided to stand down. So tonight, I'm standing up for parents and educators who do the daily work to build excellent DCPS schools to say we as a community can do better. We should not make stakeholders beg for engagement. Parents and educators should not be processed out of the system by backdoor deals. Superintendent King has said over and over the plan is just the beginning. The plan is full of policies that include let's look into it more, let's phase it in, and let's test it out first. So I ask you to make public and articulate in the plan, 1, your commitment to full transparency and ongoing engagement. 2, a schedule that you will execute on engagement at each phase of implementation with the intention to continuously improve the plan. 3, a process for implementing the task forces recommended by the state board. And 4, a process for sharing all results of the pilot and hosting engagement meetings to discuss how we should use the results to improve the system. We hope that OSSI and the state board support our calls for more engagement, more innovation, and more transparency. Our students deserve it.
Good evening. I'm Dexter Williams, a resident of Ward 7 and member of the Hillcrest Civic Association's Education Committee. I want to thank the members of the State Board of Education for the opportunity to testify about OSSI's state education plan. And I also want to acknowledge the hard work that you all have done over the last several months on this state education plan. Over the last several months, OSSI has conducted several community engagement forums across the city. Many of us who attended their Ward 7 forum left the engagement forum confused, about some aspects of their plan and concerned about its potential impact. While I understand that OSSE's role is to provide an overarching framework for public schools to implement, I am concerned that the proposal lacks clarity on key points and does not fully consider the implications for the community. In regards to family engagement, the relationship between a student's family and school is critical for educational success. ESSA encourages and incentivizes engagement activities, and I strongly recommend that the board encourage OSSE to develop a framework for rating schools based on their level of engagement with families. During OSSE's Ward 7 forum, many of us expressed concern over the stability of teachers, particularly at underperforming schools. These schools have often seen high staff and teaching turnover, critically undermining the school's ability to improve every year. These professionals are pillars of the education system, and their consistent presence among students is critical to student success and should be measured. In regards to high school metrics, I urge the board to encourage OSSE to include college enrollment through completion as a measure. While I appreciate the challenges with this kind of undertaking, although there are companies that provide this information for many districts across the country, the high school experience should give students the tools that they need to succeed in all aspects of higher education. It's important that high schools not only prepare students for the academic rigors of college, but also provide them with resources that would help them complete their degrees. There are some schools in the city and across the country that are working toward this goal, and I strongly recommend that schools be required to develop systems to track this information. As you know, OSSE's proposal sets an ambitious goal of reaching 85% proficiency in math, science, and language for all grade levels being tested by 2039, which should be applauded. However, the proposal doesn't offer guidance on how schools should achieve this goal. OSSE should revisit this and provide schools with more direction in reaching 85% proficiency. I appreciate your consideration of my concerns and look forward to working with you all in the future. Thank you.
My name is Suzanne Wells, and I'm the parent of a sixth grader at Elliott Hine Middle School. Thank you for the opportunity to speak this evening on the Office of the State Superintendent's School Accountability Measures State Plan that has been developed to comply with the Every Student Succeeds Act. The Act provides us a welcomed opportunity to make meaningful changes in how schools are held accountable. As has been said before, what gets measured gets done, so how schools are measured has profound impacts on what students are taught in the classroom, on how teachers spend their time, and on how schools serving our most vulnerable students are evaluated. There's been considerable public interest in the school accountability measures precisely because they are so important. I commend the State Board of Education for informing our community over 8 months ago about the school accountability requirements under ESSA and seeking our input on what we believe should be measured. I commend the State Board for developing a set of recommendations on OSSE's draft plan, and I commend parents in my community for taking the time to become knowledgeable about the school accountability measures plan and for thoughtfully developing comments on the draft plan. A little more than 24 hours ago, OSSE released its summary of the comments it received throughout the public comment period and the decisions it made in the updated state plan based on that feedback. I'm sorry to say that OSSE did not begin to meaningfully address the substantive comments it received from the public or the State Board of Education. OSSE's tweaked its initial proposal in minor ways. For example, it lowered the weight afforded to testing from 80 to 70%. At first glance, that might seem like a lot until you understand that virtually every public commenter asked that the weight afforded to testing be dropped to the lowest allowable by law. OSSE continues to want to use attendance as a proxy measure for school satisfaction, and their final plan increases by 1% the weight going towards attendance measures. While attendance is undoubtedly important, it's truly hard to understand why attendance, which is compulsory for students between the ages of 5 to 18, can be viewed as a meaningful measure of school satisfaction. The public repeatedly commented that school climate surveys would be better measures of school satisfaction and would provide actionable data upon which schools could make meaningful improvements. OSSE is afraid to use school climate surveys, which they believe are not adequately tested, but they are fearless about using the PARCC test, which is an imperfect measure of academic success at best. The public asked that measures on a well-rounded education be considered. In response, OSSI put a vague, yet-to-be-determined measure of access and opportunities that they want to test 2 years down the road under school environment and gave it a 5% weight. Worse still, that 5% might also have to cover whatever is decided regarding school climate surveys. So what does the OSSI state plan look like now for an elementary school? We've got 70% being dedicated to a test given once a year that is an imperfect measure of academic success. 12.5% going to measure compulsory attendance rates, 7.5% to re-enrollment, 5% to a yet-to-be-determined well-rounded education and school climate assessment, and 5% to an ESSA-required English language learner proficiency. I'd be hard-pressed to say that sounds like a solid path forward for making educational progress for our students. I suggest that the State Board of Education's work on the state plan is not done. I urge the State Board of Education to vote no on the OSSI state plan.
Thank you, panel. Do the state board members have any questions of any members of the panel?
I just have one quick one. Thank you, panelists, for your time. It looks like all of you have done your due diligence. Thank you for tuning in to our working session. Suzanne, my comment was just to clarify. You said that in your testimony, virtually every public commenter asked that the weight afforded testing be dropped to the lowest allowable by law. Can you clarify which public comments? Is that just the CHPSO meeting for Ward 6, or?
I went to both the OSSI Ward 6 meeting and to the CHPSO meeting that OSSI also arranged.
Okay, thank you. Just wanting to know, because we have seen a wide range of comments, public comments, both for and against the plan. Thank you.
Any other questions? Ms. Weidenberg?
Yeah, thanks. I'll just say I went to all of the public meetings and I looked at all of the comments, and while it's not true that there were 0 who asked for 80% or more testing, I think I could count them on one hand, and I will acknowledge that I did miss a couple of meetings. But what I want to say is, to me, a number of you mentioned the climate surveys, and to me, one of the great lost opportunities in this, and I really appeal to OSSI to maybe shift this, is there was this idea that came out of the state board to have these task forces, because there was a definite sense that the engagement of the public was inadequate. And this was really a way to pull people in and get some real school level knowledge. And I just want to say I had some excellent conversations with people from both sectors, sort of leaders of the institutions, school leaders and parents from both charter and DCPS around the climate survey issue. And there's such a lot of interest in this. There are real issues related to it, because there are lots of schools and many of them have their own surveys already, and they are not the same. This isn't something that can just simply be imposed from the top and just say, here's a survey, we want everybody to use it. That would not work. But there are a lot of ways, and I heard a lot of interest in creating cross conversations where people at the school level could talk about these different surveys, which ones worked, which ones didn't, and why, and work together to figure out some common way to use them that would be appropriate. It could be perhaps to agree on a set of different surveys, all of which would be okay. Or it might be a way of figuring out some anchor indicators across different surveys. There's a lot of ways to skin the cat. And I'm really very sorry that didn't come up. And a number of you were some of the people that I had some great conversations with. So I hope we'll still get that way, get there.
Mr. Whedon?
So, thank you. It's always great to see my Ward 6 friends. I hear you. And we've had many conversations over the last few months on many of these things. But one issue that didn't come up in any of the testimonies on this panel or the other one is the difference between growth and proficiency. And I'd love to get your thoughts on where we should land there. OSSI has made some movement. And again, as I did last night, I'd like to commend OSSI for taking a few steps. Should we take more? That's the question on the table. And we took a few steps from 80% down to 70%, and that was taken completely from proficiency, leaving growth weighted higher. Where do you all stand on that issue?
I can start. I definitely support considering growth. I can tell you at Elliott Hine Middle School, there are a number of students that have come in at the second grade reading level. And, to expect that a student coming in reading at the second grade level is going to be proficient by the time they, get done with sixth grade is not fair. And so to look at growth and see how the school can take a student who's far below grade level up 1 or 2 or 3 grade levels would make a big difference.
I can just answer quickly that in the SBOE meetings that Susanna's hosted and in the many conversations in our school community alone, the parent support and teacher support for as much growth as possible is as strong as I've seen it, not to take away all proficiency, of course, but I think people want to see that robust measure in there for all the reasons Suzanne said. That's been my experience.
Okay. No, thank you.
I agree.
Yeah.
Thank you. You dismissed. Thank you for coming out and testifying tonight. Thank you. Next panel is Sarah Stone here. All right. Erica Russell, Scott Abbott, Dana Hall, Allison Crenner Brown, Stephanie Beer, Nancy Smith, Sheila Carson Carr, Annie Fitzpatrick, Savina Sammons, Can we start with Mr. Abbott?
Good evening, members of the State Board of Education. My name is Scott Abbott. I am a Ward 4 resident, Ward 6 school parent, and the Director of Social Studies for DC Public Schools. I'm here to testify on behalf of the many people in our district and community who believe public school students in DC deserve a well-rounded education. I'm testifying tonight to urge the State Board to reject the current ESSA plan unless OSSI revises it to include all the recommendations the State Board offered last week. On the specific changes proposed, I'm glad to see the shift towards more emphasis on growth in academics and attendance. Thank you to OSSI for hearing these concerns and taking them into account. I wish I could be here testifying in support of the final plan, but these changes alone are not sufficient to merit approval. The proposed Access and Opportunities measure does not address the concerns raised by those supporting a well-rounded education indicator. Grouping well-rounded education under school environment with a school climate survey misses the point. Well-rounded education is about providing students with academic experiences and opportunities related to history, civics, science, the arts. These subjects are not nice-to-have components. These are rigorous academic disciplines that have been ignored and denied to our students, especially those in the most need. This is an issue of civil rights for our students. If we do not guarantee our schools offer even a minimum of time for teaching these subjects, we will continue to reinforce that ELA and math are all that matter. On the details of the Access and Opportunities measure, it's proposed to allot 5%, not the 10% recommended by the State Board. It's proposed to take effect in year 3, more than 2 years from now. That's too long for our students to wait. It's proposed to be created as part of a pilot during year 2, but there seems to be no guarantee this indicator would definitely be included in school year 1920, and it's unclear whether the state board would approve the addition of that after that pilot. As Jack, Marcus, and others mentioned at last night's meeting, the state board should not provide a blank check to OSSI to craft this measure with no details provided, especially after last night's meeting makes clear OSSI's intention to provide only flexible options within the measure. The process for this plan has been rushed and lacking details needed for transparency. On Monday, the Department of Education changed the ESSA regulation guidance and templates. Yesterday afternoon, OSSI released proposed updates, though still not the full plan. Today, constituents are being provided a final chance to testify on the adoption of the updated plan. This window provides little opportunity for constituents to be informed, understand and ask questions of the revisions, and share their feedback with state board members. Clearly, this plan still has problems that need to be addressed. If you vote to approve the current plan, how will you explain to your constituents why you rushed approval of a problematic plan? In conclusion, I ask the state board members to reject the current plan unless OSSI fully implements all the board's recommendations. Advocates of well-rounded education indicators were thrilled to see the board's recommendations released last week and excited that you heard and understood the voices of the community on what this plan can and must include. If OSSI is unwilling to implement your very reasonable suggestions before next Wednesday, you should feel confident that your no vote is justified. During last night's meeting, Joe mentioned the importance of doing what is right, not just what is easy. Your constituents are behind you in pushing OSSI to live up to that standard. Let's take a few more months to get this right. Our students deserve it.
Okay. Hi, my name is Stephanie Beer, and I'm a social studies teacher at Cardozo Education Campus and a resident of Ward 7. At Cardozo Education Campus, 42% of our student population are English language learners, or ELLs. The majority of the ELLs at Cardozo have arrived within the last 2 years. The number of ELLs at Cardozo is growing weekly as well as new students continue to arrive. Under the current OSSI proposal, our school's score would be 70% dependent on students' PARCC scores for ELA and geometry in the 10th grade. The current practice is that ELL students who have been in country for under a year do not test in ELA, but everyone tests in math regardless of time in country. I agree that students should not have to take the test if they have been in the country under a year, and I argue that they should also not have to test in math because the PARCC math test is language heavy. I also agree with the recommendation that these students' access growth scores replace their PARCC proficiency or growth. I believe that we should be accountable to helping these students grow in their English language proficiency. However, it is against all research on language acquisition to expect students to perform at grade level in ELA or math in only 1 year. It takes from 5 to 7 years for students to achieve academic proficiency in English, and even then, the PARCC test would still be difficult for them due to the reading levels. Being proficient in English on Access does not mean students will read at grade level. Many of our ELL students have limited to severely interrupted formal education, which often means that they are not literate in their first language. These students face additional challenges to learning a second language. They need extra support and extra time to be proficient in English and to be able to meet graduation requirements. I see no recommendations on changing the weight of graduation rates in the OSSI plan. I ask that the State Board of Education recommend that OSSI change the graduation requirements for ELL students and especially students with interrupted formal education. The criteria for this should be that ELLs with access levels 1 through 3 placed in high schools should be exempt from the 4-year graduation cohort and allowed at least 5 years to prepare for college and career readiness before graduation. Placing these students in a 5-year graduation cohort should not penalize the school score in any way. The current practice of encouraging these students to graduate within 4 years is doing them a severe disservice. They often have to pay to take remedial classes at college that are non-credit bearing courses. This means they have to spend more money, and it will take them even longer to earn a college degree, thus putting up even more barriers for them to achieve their dreams. Under the current OSSI proposal, schools like Cardozo would be penalized due to our high ELL and SPED populations. I believe that our school should be rewarded for opening our doors to these students. I also believe that school climate and culture should play a role in a school scorecard. However, I think more research does need to be done in order to accurately measure climate. I think the superficial ways of looking at some suspension numbers or what is displayed on the walls at a school is not a useful way to measure climate. Also, if surveys are to be used, they must be available in all of the home languages of the students at a school, and they should be piloted to make sure that translations make sense and that students understand what they are being asked in order to ensure accurate results. Thank you for your time.
I'm Nancy Smith. I'm a 49-year Ward 4 resident. I've had 9 kids and 2 grandchildren in the DC system almost continuously since 1971. I have a granddaughter now at Tacoma, and I'm on the PTO and the LSAT there. I'm a member of the Coolidge Community Working Group, Ward 4 Education Alliance, and SHAPE. I'm not representing any of those organizations, but I am speaking from the insights provided by the many years of involvement in DCPS. I submitted written comments on the original OSSI proposal and expressed a range of concerns, and am delighted actually to recognize that those concerns were almost entirely addressed by the State Board's recommendations. And I applaud the Board for its thoughtful approach that represents a more holistic approach to assessment of school quality. I'm extremely disappointed to see how little of your recommendations were adopted. It's my extremely strong recommendation that this Board not approve OSSI's draft until further revisions are made in alignment with your proposals. And I'm particularly concerned not only about the over-reliance on test scores. I would prefer growth to proficiency. I'm glad there's been some change, but it's still 70% is ridiculous. And I could not support Scott Abbott's testimony more on the importance of including indicators of a well-rounded education, and what they're proposing is not acceptable. I have one issue that was not addressed by the Board, and that is the proposed STAR system that reduces a school performance to a single rating based so heavily on scores on a single test, even under the changes that are proposed. Such a system is highly misleading to parents and should be replaced by a dashboard that describes the strengths, challenges, and unique characteristics or specialties of a school. While more in-depth information may certainly be available with the STAR system, the reality is that parents will quickly discount a school with a small number of stars without delving into that information. And as you know all too well, that single score is biased towards schools that serve predominantly high SES students and against those that serve high populations of ELL and SPED students, or of students facing poverty and homelessness and trauma. The latter schools may be doing a superb job of meeting the needs of their students who face serious challenges while simultaneously serving its high-achieving students well, but that single score will never let us know because it's so weighted by the kids facing so many challenges. Again, one other thing I wish could be included, by the way, in climate is a measure of teacher retention. Schools with high churn, I think that are a problem, and I think that that's more meaningful than attendance of students and re-enrollment of students. Again, I'm delighted the Board has made excellent recommendations that would result in a much improved, more flexible, and more realistic accountability system. But if your recommendations are not adopted by OSSI, I hope you'll vote no and delay submission of the plan. This is the one power the Board has, and through you, the one power the community has to shape the mechanisms of accountability for our schools. I hope OSSI responds favorably, but if they don't, I sincerely hope you will exercise your power.
My name is Ann Fitzpatrick. I'm a parent of 2 kids at School Within School at Godding, which is a DC public school. And I'm here speaking not only for myself, but for a group of parents and a teacher at that school, as well as some LSAT reps and the LSAT chair. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to provide input on OSSI's accountability plan today, as well as at the community meetings you co-hosted across the district in February. We were pleased to see in your recently released recommendations that you had been listening. Your recommendations include some key steps to address the significant concerns we have with OSSI's plan, and we urge you to hold your ground on them. You have a vital role as the voices of our community. We also urge you to tell OSSI that submitting the plan in April is not reasonable or realistic. It was clear at the community forums that parents and teachers do not think the draft plan is at all adequate. Let's take the time to put together a thoughtful plan that reflects our values. We want to share some specific concerns from our school's perspective. School Within School at Godding is a pre-K 3 to 5th grade DC public school with citywide enrollment. It exemplifies DCPS commitment to innovative, high-quality education. The school was founded in 1995 by 4 teachers who wanted to apply the Reggio Emilia education philosophy, first developed in post-war Italy by a psychologist, as it has evolved through continuous research on education. Central to our school's approach is that teachers listen to children, observe them, understand their thinking, structure activities and the environment to support and extend their thinking, and draw from their interests to plan for future learning. We have found these methods to be extremely effective for our students, and our school is drawing families from all over the city who want this progressive approach to education for their own children. The success of our school is due to enthusiastic teachers and engaged parents dedicated to seeing our children as individuals. This is the kind of innovation that is jeopardized by a top-down, narrowly focused, testing-driven accountability system. We are deeply concerned that OSSE's draft plan does not do enough to move us away from that. Tying 80% of a school's assessment, or even 70 or 74%, to a single test guarantees that teachers will feel pressured to teach to that test. When parents raised concerns at the community meetings at which I was at CHPSO as well as Ward 5, about this emphasis on testing, Superintendent Kang and her staff repeatedly noted that half of the weight, 40%, measures growth rather than proficiency. It's unclear why we would weight proficiency so heavily when weighting growth is the answer to so many concerns. Regardless, whether we weight growth or proficiency, it's all still based on a single test. We must think carefully about the incentives we create when we set up these accountability standards. Accountability that undermines a teacher's ability to meet student needs is not worth the price. In light of these concerns, we support your recommendations to expand the weight of non-test factors and to include a well-rounded education measure. I spent a few minutes on my phone trying to get up to speed on the changes proposed yesterday, and it is clear that they don't go far enough. Your recommendations were already enough of a compromise, and we urge you not to adopt the plan as proposed to be changed. We continue to support you as you stand your ground. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Savannah Samus, and I'm an instructional coach at Cardozo Education Campus and a resident of Ward 1. As an instructional coach at Cardozo, I work predominantly with our ELLs and teachers who are servicing ELL students. And I've been working with ELLs for the past 6 years, and my comment will be short about testing and accountability for our school. I strongly urge that OSSE use access scores as a growth measure instead of PARCC, especially for our beginning English language learners. As Stephanie Beer testified, our school is almost 50% ELL. And I want to give you a little bit about the context of how our school operates under all the testing. We spend all year preparing for PARCC. Students take numerous interim assessments leading up to PARCC, and our teachers spend countless morning professional development sessions analyzing PARCC questions instead of preparing and addressing the real needs of their students, such as writing curriculum for our students with interrupted education. Right? None of our DCPS curriculum meets the needs of students who have 4, 5, 6 years of gaps in their education. As an instructional coach, I've had to change my work with teachers to focus on preparing for PARCC. I'm not able to support teachers or students the way I know is most effective for student learning. And as a school, when we get into testing PARCC, we have to dedicate a great deal of resources to actually administer the PARCC exam. We have no laptops available in our entire building. When we have 800 students, about 500 take the test. At any given time, we have 100 to 200 students testing. That means no resources are available for the rest of our students. Our teaching schedule is completely interrupted for the students and the teachers. And I really urge you to consider the impact of testing, especially on schools with such diverse populations as Cardozo. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Are there any questions from the members? Mr. Jacobson.
Thank you. I'll try and be brief. Mr. Abbott, I think I've asked you this question before, but you keep using your DCPS email address and title, but your comments are your own, not DCPS's. Is that correct?
I'm here speaking on my own behalf, not necessarily on behalf of DCPS. That's correct.
Okay, great. Thank you for clarifying that. Ms. Beer, you talked about the importance of piloting metrics before they're incorporated into a plan. But we're hearing from a lot of advocates that just want us to put things into a plan without piloting them. Can you talk to a little bit to the importance of why pilots matter?
Yeah, so our school was actually part of a pilot for student surveys last year that are now used as part of the teacher evaluation system in DCPS, Impact. And we found that in piloting the surveys with the ELL population, it's a survey that's taken on a computer. The translation was very terrible in Spanish. The kids didn't understand the questions. And so I think that DCPS took that into consideration because ELL teachers are not required to have that survey as part of their evaluation. I'm not sure if I agree with that because the students could be asked in another way, or they could have improved the survey so that the students could still have give feedback on their teachers. But I think it's important that the pilot took place to make sure that it was that it showed accurate results.
Great, and it helps work out kinks and make sure that the entire process runs better after the pilot's completed. Excellent. And then finally, in my last 20 seconds, Ms. Smith, I believe, noted that this is our only power, our only authority. What I just say to you and the rest of the advocates in the room is your elected education representatives can have more authority. We need you to go to council. We need you to go to the mayor. We need you to advocate for us to be able to have that power to do more and to propose changes and to not just be given a yes or no option. So I'd encourage you and everyone else in this room and everyone who's watching on television to engage with the DC Council, engage with the mayor's office, and empower your elected education representatives with power to really represent you. So with that, thank you.
Any other comments? Ms. Wattenberg?
Yeah, I just want to, two things. One, acknowledge the interest in the well-rounded education index, which got an enormous amount of interest, and also, again, on the interest in the climate. And I want to just acknowledge that in the board's recommendation, there were 10 points for climate and 10 points for well-rounded education, because as Mr. Abbott said, they are not the same thing, but they're both super important. And the final proposal includes 5 points for both of them, and as has been noted, they're undefined. The other point I just want to make Ms. Beer, it is my understanding, and it might be that Ms. Kang wants to comment, is that with regard to giving the PARCC test, because we raised this with regard to giving the PARCC test to new immigrant students, that is a federal requirement. And while, as you can tell, I'm very critical of a number of things in this proposal, I want to be fair and say I don't think that is the result of OSSI. And the same, I believe, to the previous comment where there was a concern, which a number of us share greatly, I think all of us, that the PARCC tests have to be taken by students with a wide variety of disabilities that makes them completely useless and inappropriate. And that also is a federal requirement in the sense that we can only exempt 1%. Am I correct on that? So I just wanted to acknowledge those two things.
Can I respond to that? I know it wasn't directed to me. That just speaks to the fact that we shouldn't emphasize this test so much.
I would agree with you, and I think it is a really good reason to emphasize more the growth and less of the tests. I would totally agree with you on that. That is within the power of this proposal. Thanks for noting that.
Thank you, panel. Dismissed. Thank you.
Do you want us to just leave testimony there?
Mr. Babu Maya? Okay. Mary Levy, Alexandra Pardo, and Jessica Eos. Andrea Tucker, Maya Martin, can we start here today for this panel? Thank you. No, you, on the end. Oh, together, okay.
Good evening. I'm Alexandra Pardo of 10 Square. I'm here with Jessica Enos, who's the former Director of Assessment at OSSI. And together with Empower K-12, we submitted public testimony to OSSI on behalf of our schools. We want to highlight for you tonight 5 key priorities which we believe will improve the alignment of the accountability system and stated priorities. Priority number 1, reduce the unnecessarily long timelines. The Office of State Superintendent's plan seeks to reach commendable goals for all students and subgroups. However, the timeline is unnecessarily long with overall stated goals set for 2039, 22 years from today, and 7 years longer than any other state submitting in April. We strongly encourage OSSI to build a sense of urgency in our schools' work to close the achievement gap and shorten the proposed timeline, creating a system better aligned to expectations set by other states. Priority 2, create a governance structure of external stakeholders to steward the plan. We are concerned about the absence of meaningful stakeholder engagement in the development of policy and business rules as the plan is refined. We recommend 1, removing the details not required by the Department of Education from the plan. 2, publishing the data used to create the plan so stakeholders may better understand the policy implications and predict their scores. And 3, codifying a governance structure of external stakeholders for refinements to the plan. It is critical that those held accountable have a meaningful voice. Priority 3, refine how growth and subgroups are weighted in this plan. We concur with the State Board that a successful accountability system must identify appropriate measures and weights based on key elements of school quality. We are concerned, however, that growth and subgroup weighting in the plan are not aligned with those key elements. OSSI's plan focuses on the identification of low achievement, low growth schools over recognition of high growth, creating a bias against schools serving large at-risk populations. We urge OSSI to adjust how growth is incorporated in the plan so high growth schools can achieve high ratings. The framework focuses on subgroup performance, but the formula masks major gaps, and extreme within school gaps may result in just 1-point differences in overall scores. We recommend that OSSI revise its approach to subgroups to more strategically address this issue. Priority 4, revise ELL metrics to align with research and programmatic offerings. Research shows that language acquisition is not linear and varies based on proficiency and grade level. The current plan is built on the assumption of linear growth, rejected by WIDA. We recommend that OSSI align its plan with WIDA's research and recommendations for measuring growth. 2, DC has many wonderful language immersion programs. The goal of immersion is for students to be bilingual upon program completion, and thus the rate of language acquisition is different. We urge OSSI to consider unintended adverse impacts of unique high-value programs such as immersion programs. Priority 5, inclusion of early college access programs. High schools are the final step for preparing students for college and careers. It is essential that their measures focus on college and career readiness. Therefore, we recommend 1, including a dual enrollment participation measure. Research indicates that exposure to early college coursework is among the most effective strategies to increase college readiness. Yet dual enrollment is absent from the plan, although OSSI recognizes that over 300 students in our high schools participate in dual enrollment. 2, broadening the definition of college and career to include dual enrollment. OSSI's plan disadvantages high schools with limited AP/IB programs and dictates unfunded mandates. These programs are expensive, and schools without them are adversely impacted. We ask OSSI to define how costs associated with the AP/IB mandate will be mitigated, or to include the dual enrollment options. We commend efforts by OSSI in its first draft. We believe that a final plan that considers these concerns will create a national model for accountability that drives rapid improvement and guarantees educational equality for all. But we don't believe we need to wait 22 years for that.
Good evening. I'm Mary Levy. For those of you who don't know me, I've studied the DC public schools for the last 25 years, and I collect data. I've also participated in every major reform effort in DC public schools, including drafting a couple of plans. And I've had a great deal of opportunity to become disillusioned with accountability schemes. On the basis of months of study and public and expert comment, this board recently prepared 10 consensus recommendations for the improvement of the ESSA draft state plan that OSSI issued on January the 31st. I mean, I found those recommendations to be well thought out, to be well grounded in expert knowledge and research, and happily to be reflective of what parents and community have been asking throughout the process. Unfortunately, the very minor changes proposed in yesterday's summary responses to public engagement come nowhere near meeting the board's recommendations. I think that the heart of the problem is over-reliance on testing, by which I mean one pair of tests, ELA and math, and underuse of other important measures of educational quality. And I think this creates an accountability system that is actually counterproductive to other measures, to effective education. You've heard some of the reasons for this tonight. You've heard them at other meetings, and I put them in an earlier submission. I've repeated them below. I'm not going to go through them now, but I would like to add, listening to what people have said before, that teacher turnover of 1/3 of the faculty at high-risk schools makes it virtually impossible for them to get the kinds of stars that we wish they did. The plan as it now stands simply maintains the flaws of No Child Left Behind, limited range of metrics, and punitive pass-fail measures. And I think part of the problem there is that it's all punitive, and yet we have never addressed collectively the major disparities in opportunity for students. That really needs to be part of it. Needs to be more than just part of this plan, but we need to do it. So I hope you will act as we want good educators to do and stand by the standards that you set in the recommendations. It's what we elected you to do, and we're counting on you to do it. Thank you.
Good evening, State Board of Education members and State Superintendent King. My name is Maya Martin, and I'm a Ward 6 resident as of a week ago. I'm also the founder and executive director of PAVE, Parents Amplifying Voices in Education, whose mission is to empower, connect, and train charter parent leaders to give families in DC a voice and a choice in the vision for education in our city. At PAVE, we believe that parents are partners and leaders in developing a diversity of safe, nurturing, and great schools for every child in every ward and community, and that for too long, parents have been informed of our education policy decisions after they've already been made, instead of being invited to the table to help make them. On Thursday, March 9th, the Senate voted 50-49 to block the accountability rules for the Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA, created by the Obama administration. According to education policy analysts, without the rules, states will now have to look to the text of ESSA alone to determine what types of accountability measures are allowed under the law. Contrary to what is being said, the regulations actually gave state education agencies additional flexibility that was not found under the earlier version, ESEA. It is extremely unfortunate that Congress has taken this step, especially given that the Congressional Review Act will keep the Department of Education from making regulations like the ones that they just voted to repeal. I'm concerned that some opponents of accountability will use this opportunity to try and take control over DC's state education plan, just as they have insinuated a desire to control other things like vouchers and legalized marijuana that should be our autonomy as a state and as voters. It's extremely unfortunate as well that Congress has taken this step, but I want to encourage the DC State Board to approve the new plan's weight for student growth and achievement, which advances equity by being open about how students are performing across all demographic groups. I've been highly impressed as a resident and as an education leader with the thoughtfulness with which State Board members have taken their role in reviewing the plan, and OSSE has taken in creating and revising the plan, as you are all doing critical work to move us towards approving a quality rating system for all public schools on March 22nd. DC's state education plan includes a type of thinking that is lauded and supported by many civil rights groups, who believe states should create ratings that are in large part focused on academic growth and proficiency. And the plan was initially drafted with the Obama administration's focus on transparency, state autonomy, and accountability in mind, things that I think we can all agree are important values in a state with taxation without representation. As the executive director of PAVE, my staff and I frequently encounter parents who are frustrated by the inability to determine how their children's charter school is performing in comparison to all the other district public schools across the city. They are excited about the prospect of a new uniform accountability system, and they want to make sure that their children attend schools where academics are at the forefront of the decision making. The current plan allows for just that, with the largest share, 40% of the measure, focused on growth, with 30% for elementary and middle school focused on proficiency, and with 25% focused on the school environment. I understand concerns that some parents have expressed about the potential of over-testing and the pressures teachers face when they work with students who are well behind academically. However, the parents and community leaders that we work with, that sit on our board of directors, and that we talk to on a daily basis want us to be honest about how our students are actually performing. I have high ambitions for what students can achieve with the right amount of support, caring teachers, and well-designed curriculum. And as a fifth-generation Washingtonian whose grandparents attended Dunbar High School when it was known as one of the best high schools in the country at a time when DC did not expect Black children and youth to perform at such high levels, I know that our DC schools and our DC kids can all achieve and succeed. Thank you for all of your hard work in getting a plan that incorporates the voices of all of our parents and that keeps its focus on the power and promise of the public education of our kids. All children deserve to go to great schools. And please support DC's accountability framework and make sure that we hold everyone accountable for great schools made up of a positive school culture and climate and high academic growth and achievement.
Good evening, members of the State Board of Education, and thank you for allowing me to testify here today. My name is Andrea Tucker. I'm a native of Washington, D.C., a Ward 8 resident, and a parent of 3 at J.L. Wilson Elementary School, a Title I school in Ward 6. I am also the PTA president, a member of the LSAT, and a proud graduate of J.L. Wilson Elementary School. I want to first thank you for your 10 recommendations on how to improve the accountability plan. Your recommendations reflected many of my concerns and those of other parents I heard at a community meeting last month where OSSI presented on the plan and took questions. Prior to the meeting, I thought that the plan would represent a new way of thinking in DC. I thought it would be an opportunity to look at our unique city and create an accountability plan that will work for our schools and for our children. That was not what I heard there. Instead, I heard about an accountability plan that rates schools almost entirely on reading and math scores. Making sure students have access to arts and science and social studies and technology is important to having a well-rounded education. It is something we should encourage in every school across the city. So I was glad to see your recommendations on the need to evaluate our schools based on a well-rounded education and not focus so narrowly. We know that all schools are equal in their course offerings, now, and this plan should be one way to push the system towards equity, not create wider divisions in quality. If all schools are judged by not just reading and math, but other subjects, wouldn't that be one way to encourage all schools to offer them? I hope that you will make these changes towards a well-rounded education view now and not wait and revisit it in the need for it later. My concern is that once the plan goes through the approval process, we may not have a chance to revisit it. I have not seen the final plan to know whether or not or how much has been included in there. As a proud DCPS alumni and a current parent with children in DCPS, I have been a witness to what makes a great school. While test scores are one factor I use to judge a school, it is definitely not the only one. I also care a lot about the culture and climate of the school. It is important that kids are safe in an environment in the school and is conducive to learning. I was glad to see your recommendations address culture and climate and understanding the quality of a school. I am hopeful it is now a part of the plan and not one to put off for the future. I also care about holding teachers and staff accountable for children's learning or lack thereof. No child should go to middle or high school reading on the second grade level. I do not believe that the State Board of Education should approve this plan without having OSSI make these changes first and allowing the public to have one more opportunity to review it. We have done our part by attending the meetings and reading the plan. OSSI has not done its part in sharing back changes in a timely manner, so I have not had the time to understand any of the changes. I will close by saying that at the community meeting I attended in Ward 6 was a large gathering of parents who were diverse in every way, but we are united in our questions, concerns, and goals. That was very reassuring to know that we are all pushing in a similar direction for our children, and I hope city leaders are listening and will make necessary changes. Thank you for your time and inviting public testimony on this issue.
Thank you, panelists, for coming out and testifying. Does the board have any questions? Mr. Whedon?
So I want to return to a question I asked earlier with this panel as well. Where do you all stand on the issue of proficiency versus growth? I've heard that a lot, and it was touched upon, but I'd like to hear a little bit more.
So we think both measures are important, but I think one thing that's lost a little bit in this conversation is that growth can be a methodology and not a distinct measure. Everything can be measured in achievement and growth if you look at things year over year. For example, if you look at attendance, you can look at how a school performs on attendance in 1 year and their in-seat attendance rate. You can also look at how that school moves attendance year over year. So you can look at every measure as both an achievement and a growth measure. And so I think as part of our public comments, we'd love to see more domains incorporate growth in addition as a methodology.
Okay, I think growth is much more important, and particularly when you think about the secondary schools. They take their students as they get them.
Yep.
And if all you're going to put too much on proficiency, and I think that was well illustrated by talking about the students who arrive from other countries with interrupted educations. Why should you punish the school and the teachers? Because they may be in the 9th grade and reading, if at all, in a 2nd grade level.
Right.
I think the only other thing I would add is it's really important, as I said in my testimony, so WIDA, which is the consortia that DC works with to measure ELL students, has methods of measuring growth that are based on scaled scores. The current plan as proposed wants to use proficiency levels, which WIDA actually says you cannot use to measure growth. And so we'd really urge OSSI to go back to the WIDA research on how to measure growth for ELL students and use that proposed methodology rather than proficiency levels.
Thank you.
I didn't realize that OSSI had been talking about using proficiency levels as opposed to just proficiency. I mean,
ELLs only.
Well, oh, for EL, okay, because scaled scores tell us much, much more.
Mr. Jacobson?
Thank you. Ms. Martin, I was hoping that you might talk a little bit more about why academics need to be at the forefront, according to PAVE.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. One of the things that we've had a lot of conversations with parents about is that in terms of their qualitative understanding of school performance, they get a lot of that from other parents. So they do a lot of their homework and their work, going on school tours, going on school visits, talking to families. Some parents get it from websites like DC Urban Moms and Dads. Some parents are getting it from the My School DC website or from, conversations that they're having with different stakeholders. But parents have communicated that, like, look, we get that information from other families and we understand some of those qualitative measures. What is much harder for families to understand are the quantitative measures that right now are not consistent across the sectors. And so parents bring up that, like, when they look at a DCPS school, they're seeing something different from when they're looking at a public charter school. And that's really hard for parents to understand the differences between those two systems. And so I think what parents would like to see is what are the academic measures that we can use and we can make transparent across both of the school systems in our entire education system. So I think that's one of the things that parents have talked about. And to go back to Joe's question about growth, I think that this plan has 40% being growth and 30% being proficiency. And that is something that I think reflects the concerns that parents have made about making sure that it's reflecting the progress and the growth that students are making year over year. And so I think parents want to also put that at the forefront, which I appreciate that this plan has been able to do.
Great. And in my last 30 seconds, another question for you. Does PAVE object to any of the qualitative measures that are included in OSSI's plan?
So, I mean, I think one of the, we don't object to the attendance or the re-enrollment rate. I think that's partially because we've been working with a PCSB performance management framework that parents understand and that they've been using to help them inform decisions. I think the other part about the climate is not something we object to, but it's also something that hasn't been totally ironed out yet. So it's not something that we object to, the parents object to at all. It's just something that we'd love to see more information about what that will wind up looking like.
Thank you to you and the entire panel.
Ms. Wattenberg?
Excuse me, can I have a chance to respond to Mr. Whedon's question? Okay, Mr. Whedon, as far as growth, I would like to say that just says all children don't learn the same, all children don't test the same, so you can't really get the true essence of who a child is by taking a test, because so many different factors can come into play that day they take a test. So you can't say whether they're truly proficient in that subject or not by just one test.
All right, Ms. Wattenberg, thank you. Ms. Wattenberg?
Excuse me, I have a question. I'd like to ask Ms. Martin a question in regards to growth. You spoke of growth, and I would just like to know, do the parents you speak to have children? Do any of the parents you speak to have children that are in high school?
So most of our families have kids that are in elementary and middle school, and a lot have students that are in middle school, and fewer have students that are in high school. We do have some who are at like Thurgood Marshall and some of the charter high schools, but most have children that are in elementary and middle school.
So in terms of growth for high school, you haven't heard any communication about that from your parents?
Yeah, I mean, and that one's a little bit harder simply because the high school testing is very, very different from the elementary and middle school testing. So that one is harder to kind of suss out in terms of what grade levels are tested and when. So,
and so I would like to ask anyone on the panel that has some experience with growth, if you could speak to it for high school. Yeah.
Sure. So in my former role, I was the executive director of Thurgood Marshall for 9 years, which is a charter high school in the district. And so for high schools, I think growth is critically important because, as you've heard tonight, students come into high schools throughout the district many, many years behind. Not all students, but some of our students. And so having a measure that recognizes when I get you in 9th grade and you are in the 5th grade, how much have I moved you by 10th grade is critical. But simultaneously, I think OSSI should be commended because the other part where we're not talking about is how do you measure growth for SAT or ACT, and including that in our high school growth measures, because students also grow on other college-bound metrics. And so having both in a measure that is going to look at high school growth from 9th to 10th grade or 8th grade, and then looking at that PSAT, which is down the pike, I think is essential for schools because that is the last time. When a student is not on grade level in 5th grade and 8th grade, you get to move them on. But high schools is that stopgap. If we don't do it right in high schools, we fail those students. There's not a second opportunity after that.
Thank you.
Alexandra Pardo.
So I want to go back to something that you raised about the growth issue, where you talked about, I don't know if it was a concern or a question or an issue related to how the current plan addresses high-growth, low-score schools and whether or not the current plan would adequately recognize them. So I just wanted to hear what you had to say about that.
Yeah, I'll let Jess actually talk about that.
Sure. So we did a little bit of modeling, and where our concern is that when we modeled out using the framework details that were available to us, if we look at a huge gap school, a no gap school, and 2 schools that are very homogeneous, we see that all students, you get a score for all students, then you get a score for each subgroup of students based on the subgroups that are in your school. When we did that modeling out, we found that a huge gap school, based on the fake data that we put in there, if all students had 1 score and then there was a giant gap between 2 subgroups, they would only score 2 points lower in their overall school score than a school with no gap or 2 different homogeneous schools, regardless of how those schools performed or how students in those schools typically perform. So we're really concerned that gap, a no school gap versus a huge school gap, could score really similarly.
So that's one issue, is that the way in which the subgroups are calculated could mean that a high gap school does not get flagged.
Correct.
And what about a school that is low scoring and high growth? Was that something else that you addressed?
Absolutely, I apologize. A high growth school would have to score almost perfect on every other metric in order to get a high star rating. On every other metric, they would have to score almost perfectly.
If they were low proficiency, they'd have to score almost perfectly on everything else to get a high star rating.
Correct.
Thank you. And your modeling, you say that was based, did I hear you say on fake numbers or on real numbers, or?
It's based on the rules in the plan, but it's based on data that is publicly available, sample data. If all students scored 75%,
So I guess my time is up. Is some of that data available for us to look at?
We have historical school data, but in terms of,
I mean, not the data, but the modeling? Is that something that we could
I mean,
touch
we'd be
base with
happy
you?
to
Terrific.
share that with you.
Because we are very eager, we'd be very eager to see that, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Panel is dismissed. Thank you very much for testifying. Amber Schlick, Eric Martell, Kathy Riley, Emily Gossi, and Emily Merchner.
Can I see this part? Wait, can I see this part?
Hello, my name is Amber Schlick, and I'm the Strategy and Policy Manager for E.L. Haynes Public Charter School. On March 3rd, we submitted public comment to OSSI in response to the draft state plan posted in late January. We gave specific feedback on several metrics outlined in the plan, which I will share with the State Board today. We appreciate the opportunity to provide comments on the proposed DC state plan under the Every Student Succeeds Act and OSSI's effort to engage LEAs in the development of the new state accountability framework. The following comments are based on Section 4, Accountability, Support, and Improvement for Schools of the draft state plan. Generally, we recommend OSSI review the entire Section 4 of the plan to focus on explaining the main ideas of the accountability system, rather than specific metrics and targets. The plan should preserve OSSI's flexibility to partner with LEAs to establish final metrics and business rules. We especially want to bring your attention to the following areas. Floors and targets. The current floors and targets included in the plan are too specific at this point in the process, and OSSI needs to conduct more modeling and facilitate additional feedback sessions before establishing final floors and targets. Additionally, OSSI should consider creating a minimum range for metrics where the 10th and 90th percentiles are too close together. For example, on the performance management framework, the Public Charter School Board has established a minimum range for in-seat attendance because the 10th and 90th percentiles are less than 10 percentage points apart. Without a minimum range, the point fluctuation with even an immaterial change in attendance would be large. Growth to proficiency. The description of growth to proficiency metric should be revised to focus on the goal of including growth to proficiency as a metric instead of already specifying the actual growth targets, i.e. students who start in levels 1, 2, and 3 must grow at least 1/3 of the gap each year. For example, OSSI could revise the language at the end of page 42 by saying, to complement the median growth percentile and address some of these limitations, OSSI will also include a measure of growth to proficiency in the accountability framework. Growth to proficiency is the percent of students who meet a scale score growth target. We will continue to research absolute growth targets and will establish targets before the 2017-18 school year. ACT, SAT, DC 50th percentile threshold. We support that OSSI is intentionally including a metric that will show progress schools are making with students who have not yet met the college-ready benchmark on the SAT. However, given the uncertainty of how the SAT and ACT metrics will be calculated in the new accountability framework, we strongly recommend OSSI remove the 50th percentile threshold and revise the description of this measure to say ACT, SAT, intermediate benchmark metric. Alternative graduation rate. E.L. Haynes appreciates OSSI's effort to ensure that schools who graduate students beyond 4 and 5 years receive credit within the accountability framework. However, our concern is that the current metric may not accomplish this goal. As it stands, schools with a high 4-year graduation rate will still have a high alternative graduation rate. They will therefore raise the targets in the framework and make it difficult for schools with low 4-year graduation rates to earn points, even if they graduate significant numbers of students who complete their degrees in 5 years or more. For each of the above metrics, we recommend OSSI limit the detail outlined in this section and establish a technical working group to solidify the details before the 2017-18 school year. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you so much. Mr. Martell.
Thank you. My name is Eric Martell, retired DCPS high school teacher. You can only fairly and validly evaluate individuals. You cannot evaluate a collective entity such as a school staff. The 2 or 3 whole school averages derived from tests, climate scores, or graduation rates are inherently unethical and invalid. Student tests that have no consequences for students, but are used to evaluate teachers and staff, and even excess staff in closed schools are unreliable. They don't describe the strengths and the needs of the teaching staff. These so-called school accountability criteria infantilize students and disempower teachers. Students are informed that they are not responsible for their learning, their test results, their attendance, their behavior, and their school's atmosphere. Only their schools, teachers, and staff are. It seems like many of the schools in the city have not been visited by people who write these rules. And I realize that many of them come from the U.S. Department of Education and from OSSE, and that this body does not have a lot of authority, and everyone, as Mr. Jacobson said, needs to try to get more authority so that, but nonetheless, you do have the power of the pulpit. A good example of this was what happened at Wilson High School last year, where students acted in their own self-interest and did not. Some of them skipped the park test. Some of them deliberately went through it very quickly so they could do what? Study for something that meant something, AP exams. All right, so one of the recommendations I am suggesting that you add is that in all publicly funded DC schools, students who receive level 1 scores on the PARCC ELA and PARCC mathematics tests be retained in grade. How many were there last year? Quite a few. And well, I'm just talking about level 1. Level 2 is also a failing level. 1,300 high school students on the geometry exam got level 1, 6,300 on the math exam, grades 3 through 8, and 7,200 3 through 8 students on the ELA portion of the test. Let's see. To get an idea of the unethical aspect of this, just imagine if teachers were told that they can only give a single grade to all the students in their classes. Consider what the impact of that would be. Yet we can give single grades to an entire school staff as if everybody had the same effect on students' performance without the students being held responsible for any aspect of it. Or, not just the students, what about the evaluating the effectiveness of the various mandates that teachers are required to follow, all the time spent on meetings or even the questions on how effective Common Core is.
Thank you, Mr. Martell.
So,
Thank you, Mr. Martell.
and I'll just finish by saying that the DCMR says that there are only so many, after 10 unexcused absences, there needs to be a whole series of procedures that are followed other than to have the student's grade lowered. You should find out from the state superintendent whether or not if she has any records of the many students there were 862 students who had over 21 unexcused absences in this 2016 graduation class.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Holly.
My name is Kathy Riley, and I'm the director of the Senior High Alliance of Parents, Principals, and Educators, and a Ward 4 resident and part of the Ward 4 Education Alliance. Thank you for this opportunity. This is a quote from the, from the final regulations of ESSA. The bipartisan law and the ESSA regulations give states and districts the opportunity to move beyond No Child Left Behind's reliance on a limited range of metrics and punitive pass-fail labels for schools and use their planning and accountability processes to reimagine and redefine what a high-quality education should mean for their students. To that end, the final regulations use multiple measures of school success, reinforcing that all students deserve a high-quality and well-rounded education that will prepare them for success. This is the vision we are working from. Whatever is approved will be operational across both sectors and become the common metric. We do not view this as primarily an instrument to facilitate school choice. Our read on what parents and citizens would like is a high-quality education for all students at all of our schools. The recommendations by the board and the feedback from the community meetings affirmed this. What is measured or what is prioritized and taught. This is an opportunity. You as the Board of Education have given OSSI a roadmap to a much better definition of a high-quality education. It is our best hope that you will use your authority as our representatives to ensure that your roadmap is followed. It was reasonable and well thought out. For the high school, while adjustments for improvement in attendance and expansion to 9% for the alternative graduation rate are welcome, the failure to include a growth metric or a school climate survey is still a big problem. We don't want you to just include it without a pilot. The 2 years was too long. OSSI has said that they share this concern, however, they are not committed to it in the policy. I see students who may not be getting a 3 on the AP or PARCC still getting an education that is moving them forward. I see them as Woodson students arguing a court case at the district court or Blue students being accomplished members of a band. The whole purpose of ESSA was to allow school districts to show this and encourage these pursuits as part of a quality education. While the aim is to continue improving test performance and attendance and grad rates, this is not the sole focus of the professionals in our high schools, nor should it be. My concern is that I don't see school quality adequately reflected yet, and I see schools that are working with young people that come in with significant challenges unfairly evaluated. The 5-star rating system contributes to the inequality embedded in the current draft. So even with the best intentions of OSSI, your recommendations have to be better reflected in the policy you vote on. We just see too much turnover and change and too many broken promises to not need it in policy before you vote. So I went on to say what's not right yet for the elementary and middle schools. And I just want to say in closing, our passion on this comes from a belief that the work you do here is very important, and it will have a large impact on the education of our young people. A poor, blunt instrument actually does harm. So by March 22nd, you still have time to make changes, and if not, I think you should vote it down and go back to editing. We believe you can get it right. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you for this opportunity to testify. My name is Emily Gassoy. I'm a Ward 1 resident. I'm a parent of a pre-K4 student in DC, and I'm an educator. I've played many roles, including being a classroom teacher for almost 10 years, and I've been a new teacher mentor here in DC. And first of all, I just want to echo a lot of what I've heard tonight, including to commend the State Board of Education for including what I heard at the 2 forums that I attended reflected in the recommendations. I want to focus on 2 related points. One is, again, echoing what I've already heard, which is that the emphasis on student test scores, that reducing it from 80 to 70% really doesn't do anything to address the many, many concerns that we've heard, the wide range of concerns. And I'm not going to repeat them because they've been already talked about both at the forums and here. But at both forums I attended, the primary obstacles that I heard OSSI representatives cite was the thing that was preventing them from considering alternatives to standardized testing were the lack of adequate structures and knowledge about how to collect alternate data. And I think this is a really serious issue, and it's not something that can be addressed quickly. And so what it made me realize is that there's really no way for OSSI to truly address the concerns they've been hearing in the short amount of time that they are giving themselves to put this plan into place. So my second point is related to this, which is that I strongly urge all of you to vote no unless OSSI agrees to take the time necessary to, for instance, do the research it would require. And I know one of the recommendations was to have a team that would give advice about, how to go forward. I think this should actually be expanded into either a semi or a permanent team that would offer research. So I therefore urge you to recommend that the date of completion for the plan be deferred at least until September. But really, if possible, I recommend putting off implementation of the plan for at least a year in order to put the level of research, thought, creative energy, and effort that a meaningful revision of this plan truly requires. At the very least, I suggest that OSSI include an amendment to the current plan that would include a gradual reduction of the weight tests have and the introduction of alternative assessments over the next several years. I would also recommend that the task force proposed become a permanent research and development team that would help create and sustain the necessary support for alternative assessment systems. Thank you.
Hello, good evening. My name is Emily Mechner. I'm a Ward 1 resident, a DC parent of 3 kids in elementary and middle school, an LSAT member, and I'm also an economist. I urge the SBOE to reject the superintendent's proposal, which I believe was doomed by its failure at the outset to coherently define the purpose of the measurement it was setting out to create. The State Board suggested revisions, while slightly diminishing over-reliance on test scores, nonetheless, I apologize, perpetuate the muddled overall approach that OSSI began with and will satisfy nobody and serve no goal well. The purpose of school assessment is to provide a tool for evaluating the success of education agencies in achieving educational outcomes. How well does a school serve the educational needs of its students? Measurement is powerful. It guides educational practice and strategy by providing incentives for education professionals to channel their energies for the greatest impact on what is measured. As such, it is very important to align your measurement tool with the goals you intend. But once you start measuring and generating data, people will take the information you give them and try to bend it to their own needs. Once you put out ratings, people will try to read into those ratings what they want to know. For example, what's the best school to choose for my child? That is a very different question. It is a question so different, in fact, that it is impossible to construct a single univariate measure that answers both questions. In key respects, the two have opposite implications for what you want to measure. For any parent confronting the question of school choice, interesting things to know are, what kind of kids and families go to this school? Will my child fit in? Will the school leaders understand my child's needs? Will the teachers be attuned to my child's challenges? It's easy to understand why parents would care about measures of the level of test scores like proficiency rates. They will similarly want information about demographics. Fair-minded people who are interested in constructing a rating to answer this kind of school assessment question will disagree over how much weight to put on test scores versus socio-emotional, intangibles, curriculum diversity. Indeed, the right weights may differ from one child to another. The best approach is to provide undigested information about interesting school characteristics and let people apply their own weights in the matter of evaluation. However, the question from the point of view of educators and what they spend their scarce time, effort, and money on is quite different. Public schools take the students they get, regardless of demographic characteristics, with whatever challenges and resources they bring, and must do their best to promote the academic, socio-emotional, artistic, and moral growth of all, from wherever they begin to the next level. They should be rewarded for being effective at this. Why any weight at all should be given to test score levels as opposed to growth is unclear. Why should a school get credit for the skills the child walks in the door with? The interest of the state is in evaluating the ability of a school to educate its students, to produce growth. Again, fair-minded people will recognize that there is more, I and many people here argue a lot more, to measuring educational achievement than PARCC test scores, and that there is some subtlety in finding the right way to aggregate individual growth results into a simple score or rating. These are the key questions one must address in formulating a fair and useful measure of school performance. But it is incoherent to try to split the difference between measuring educational performance on the one hand and school characteristics on the other hand by combining elements of the two. The resulting ratings would be less useful than any of its components. The effort that's been made thus far by all involved has not been wasted. To align the measure of school effectiveness with its purpose, focus on measuring student growth. Use test score growth in the areas of educational achievement that can be measured with standardized tests, and continue developing valid and reliable instruments to measure growth in areas that defy test-based quantification. Be very thoughtful about how you aggregate and what those choices imply about which children's achievement matters more than who else's. For example, overweighting the growth of those who cross an arbitrary proficiency threshold, as OSSE's original proposal does, should not survive scrutiny. Separately, think about the most informative way to provide families making their school choice decisions with the information they want. But do not conflate this objective with the other, and do not allow the primary goal of school performance evaluation required by federal law to be subverted by other purposes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the board members? Mr. Jacobson?
Ms. Mechner?
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes, thank you.
Excellent. You talk about growth. Is there a way to understand how a student is growing without assessing the student?
I do mean to make assessments and then measure the growth in their performance on that assessment, whatever it may be.
So you agree that there needs to be assessment to understand the student's growth. Great. On the proficiency point, I'm wondering if we could talk about that for a second.
Sure.
My understanding from my own experiences in college and employment is that my employer expects me to be proficient at a certain level to be able to get a job and maintain that job, or to get into grad school or things like that. I have to reach a certain threshold, which is a proficiency level. Why would that not be important for students to be at a certain proficiency level?
Well, it is. That's what grades are for. Kids have transcripts. But we're talking about something different, which is to evaluate the school's performance in helping students achieve not just proficiency, but for kids who are already proficient, to help them achieve beyond. So when I disparage this overweighting kids who pass from below proficient to just above proficient, so passing that threshold, what that means is that you have a kid who's, say your threshold is 50th percentile, right? You have a kid who starts at the 49th percentile and they gain 10 points. Ding, you passed 50. Consider a second child who starts out measured at 51 percentile, right? So they're already proficient. And then they gain 10 points. What you're saying is these two 10 percentage point gains from somebody who started out really close to the middle are not really the same. One of them is much more important than the other. I think that's a real mistake.
Thank you for sharing those thoughts and that experience. Very helpful. Thank you, Mr. President.
If there are no more questions, thank you, panel, for coming out tonight.
Wait. I do have one. Well, they're out here, and I'm going to ask them questions. So a couple of you mentioned the idea that maybe it's plausible that we can't have well-piloted metrics immediately, but that one thing that could make a big difference would be if the proposal included a very serious process and timeline and commitments for how we would get to some new places. For example, how would we do high school growth, or how could we measure school climate and for how much, and how can we measure well-rounded education for how much? I just wonder if there's anything more that anybody wants to say on that.
I think the E.L. Haynes proposal for a technical working group on a piece of it, and the task force proposals of the board, I think they have to be embedded in order to actually happen. And that that your proposal, Erica, Emily, on the more thought into how we divide these things. But I think what we had concern with was the 2 years before it was even implemented, so that there's no, we understand there has to be a pilot and it has to be well done, but 2 years is too long, and the process wasn't outlined. So that was where the concerns were. Nobody wants to do something in a hurry that's wrong, but we have to take the time to get this right. So I think you have waiting till September on it, and you have a much shorter timeline for the technical working group or the task forces to work, and then for the implementation to take place.
I think there also just has to be a goal of knowing why students are doing well, why other students are doing poorly, and this should be shared with you. I don't know if you received that information, and with the public, rather than this goal of collective evaluation of schools, close them or impose some punitive measures on them, and then as if that's going to solve anything.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions? Thank you again, panel. Thank you for staying so late to testify. The next panel is Erin Easing, Jessica Papalia, Sarah Livingston, Elizabeth Davis, Ann Onquist, Is Nancy Hyvendyke here? Carla Reed Witt?
Because you were there, you see they got you.
We'll call you again in
No, okay.
Sorry.
They all have the car keys, that's all they all have.
Miss.
Oh, I'm first?
Yes.
I'm sorry.
No problem.
Hi, my name is Carla Reed Witt. I fully support all of the State Board's recommendations regarding DC's ESSA accountability plan. I have 3 kids. The first and the last are 8 years apart. My youngest is now a 9th grader. My middle child is a 12th grader. My oldest is 22 years old. All 3 attended the same middle school. Within the 8 years between my oldest entering middle school and my youngest entering middle school, public education completely changed. I blame overemphasis on testing for this great downfall. When my oldest entered public school, I knew the school system was struggling, but I thought, we can pull this off. As I look back, I liken public education to the Titanic. When my oldest came along, we knew the ship was struggling, but we were still afloat. When my middle child came through middle school, the boat was at 45 degrees. And when my youngest hit middle school, we were fully vertical. She was hanging on to the rails with her legs dangling. I don't think the downfall is teachers. In fact, I know it isn't. I don't think it's principals or school district leaders. I think the downfall is behavior. Behavior driven by an accountability system based almost entirely on test scores. When you design an accountability system, in effect, you create an adult behavior plan. Teachers, principals, system leaders, and even parents are trapped into behaving in ways which optimize numerical outcomes favored by the accountability system, whether or not they feel their decisions are in the best interest of students. The current plan does not contemplate this, nor does it contemplate diversity within racial, ethnic, geographical, disability, or income groups. For example, the current plan includes different growth rates goals based on race. Let's pretend it's school year 2017-18 and I am a school district leader. According to the current version of the plan, the percentage of Black students who must score level 4 or higher in ELA is 25.2%, and the number of white students who must score level 4 or higher is 79.8%. Black students in my school will easily meet the 25.2 threshold goal. In fact, I could push them far beyond that goal. However, a number of my white students are struggling. I'm worried that they won't meet the 79.8% white student goal. Where do you think I'll focus my resources? How do you think I'll behave? We need a new plan. I would like OSSI to wait to submit the plan until we can get it right. We need to design a child-centered plan focused on maximization of adult behavior, not for the purpose of improving test scores, but rather for the purpose of achieving good life outcomes for all students.
Hi. I'm going to just let you know that my name is Sarah Livingston. I'm a citizen of DC, and I live in Ward 6. And I do want to quickly thank everyone who's been involved in formulating DC's state accountability plan for the enormous amount of work that's gone into it. And I appreciate OSSI's responses to several public comments, and I support the board's 10 recommendations for improving the plan. Regrettably, though, it appears to me that we have come to yet another impasse between the will of the people as represented by the elected board and the will of the unelected OSSI. Judging by how impasses have been resolved in the past, such as on high school credit flexibility last year, I am deeply concerned that the current impasse will be resolved by OSSI as it was before, by overriding the will of the people and DC's plan winding up not being one that is of, by, and for the people. I believe these impasses and their resolutions in favor of OSSI are rooted in the relationship between the two state education entities that was created in the Public Education Reform Amendment Act of 2007, whereby the elected body was made subordinate to the appointed state superintendent rather than the other way around. In the states, the State Board of Education, whether elected or appointed by the governor, is the decision-making body on state policy, and the state superintendent, whether elected or appointed, is subordinate to it, serving as the implementer and administrator of the board's decisions. Fortunately, the writers of the Constitution for the state of Washington, D.C. recognize that having an elected state board with only the power to advise the state superintendent does not conform to the authority and structure of a state government, and they made a correction in Article 2, Part 3, Section 3. That provision gives the board the responsibility of advising the governor on matters of state educational policy, and it would make DC's state education governance structure and process much more democratic. The will of the people, as expressed in their vote for board members and the board's representation of the people's voice, would flow directly forward to the governor rather than backward into an appointed office that has the power to override and negate it. We do not have to wait for Congress to admit DC as a state to have the benefit of this provision. We can have it now by calling on the council to amend the para so that the board has the responsibility for advising the mayor. To that end, I testified to the Committee on Government Operations week before last that para should be amended to allow this provision of the state constitution to be implemented now. I encourage everyone who feels cheated by having a vote for representatives that means next to nothing, and who feels that it is highly hypocritical for DC to demand statehood as the surest way to gain full democratic rights while its own laws insult and prevent full democratic self-determination on education matters, to also speak up. The provision is by no means a cure-all for everything that ails democratic governing of education in DC, but is a step in the direction of restoring meaning to the vote that millions of Americans have died to protect or to obtain, for the board to play a more state-like role in education governance, for the mayor to have the benefit of the people's voice in an ongoing way through the board, and for the conditions that lead to impasses like the one we're facing now to finally be cleared out from our government's operations, leaving it both more democratic and efficient.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening. I'm Elizabeth Davis, Ward 5 resident and president of the Washington Teachers Union. And of course, I have axed my testimony by about 1/2 because I've heard everything that I wanted to say said here, and I'm excited about it. One of the things that our members encouraged me to speak to was, of course, the great weight that this plan has given to testing. And of course, if states choose a robust survey of school climate as their school quality indicator, something that we have not talked enough about, they can shift schools' attention from raising test scores to making changes that improve school climate, teaching, and student learning. In addition, such a climate survey would provide invaluable information to parents about the environment and learning conditions in each school to help them choose the best school for their children. DC educators and parents are excited about the opportunities ESSA offers our school district to select school climate measures to enhance school accountability, school improvement, and parent choice. However, OSSE school accountability proposal to give standardized test scores 80% of an elementary school's overall rating, with the remaining 20% primarily on attendance and re-enrollment rates, give zero weight to comprehensive school climate measures that are known to help schools improve. By so doing, OSSE's draft gives 0% weight to comprehensive school climate measures. Under the current OSSE accountability proposal, there is no credit for growth in our schools in this proposal, and this is a serious problem for educators. Parents and teachers have urged OSSE and the State Board of Ed to reduce the weight of test scores to the lowest percent legally allowed, around 55% for elementary grades and less for high schools. Given equal weight and rating to proficiency and growth, unfairly favors school in high-income areas where the vast majority of students have family and economic advantages and are proficient. Moreover, it unfairly penalizes schools in low-income areas where the vast majority of students are often disadvantaged and below proficiency. OSSE's proposal needs to be revised to give more weight in the test score indicators to growth than to proficiency. For example, giving 40% of total weight to growth and 10% to proficiency. Parents and the 4,800 teachers, those who work closest with students on a daily basis, understand that reducing measurements for school quality has had a negative impact on learning environments. It has grossly failed to close the achievement or opportunity gap, and it has contributed largely to the growing educational disparities in our school district. What we hold schools accountable to is what gets prioritized in our students' day-to-day life. If 80% of a school's accountability measure is based on test scores, then that is what the vast majority of the time will be spent on. When we measure academic performance solely on proficiency, we're negating the important work that schools are doing with students who enter significantly below grade level. ESSA implementation and consequences have effects on our students' overall educational experience. When high-stakes accountability measures are tied to student performance without adequate school supports, schools that serve our highest need students will have trouble maintaining staff and resources. ESSA regulations allow OSSE to submit an accountability plan by either April 3rd or September 18th. Yet OSSE is trying to submit the plan by April 3rd. This rush schedule undermines the ability of educational stakeholders to collaborate on developing robust school accountability measures that can help schools improve and would severely restrict the new chancellor's capacity to close the achievement gap. By August 2017, the task force that we have encouraged in a current letter to the state board members basically would serve as a pilot, which could be conducted in the fall, which would allow time for revision to the plan and also time to administer an accountability in spring of 2018. The way OSSE would be able to publicly report the results for ratings before the beginning of the 2018-19 school year as required by Department of Ed would be also satisfied. This task force would advise what best weights to give to a school climate and other indicators of success in OSSE's January 30th draft state plan. In summary, OSSE should heavily reduce the weight of test scores and school ratings, replace the reduced weight with weight for robust school climate measures within test scores, shift much more weight to growth than proficiency, defer submitting an accountability proposal to DOE until September 18th, and create an advisory task force representing all key stakeholders, DCPS, the union, teachers, charter school stakeholders, and others to collaborate with OSSE on revising its accountability plan. If we fail to take advantage of every opportunity ESSA offers to fix our schools, then we basically failed our children. The 4,800 members of the Washington Teachers Union, again, those that I respect most in terms of having a thought about what improves achievement, what counts for school success. The teachers that are now working with our kids on a daily basis urge you to send this plan back for revision, and until the community has had an opportunity to advise, revise, and also have input from other stakeholders that have not had a chance to weigh in. Thank you, and I am available to answer any questions any of you may have.
Good evening. My name is Erin Thiesing. I'm a Ward 1 resident. I'm also a 5th grade teacher at Morey Elementary School. I also will try to trim things based on hearing repeats tonight. But I come tonight having taught at a range of diverse schools, including a no excuses turnaround charter school, a project-based learning charter school, and now a traditional DCPS elementary school. And I think my experience along the way has really allowed me to meet people from across the spectrum, and teachers, parents, school leaders, community members. I think we all agree that, we're all coming here wanting good schools for our students. For me, though, that's why I'm asking you to vote no on the proposed state accountability plan. When PARCC scores are the primary metric of school success, less time is reserved for useful assessments and meaningful learning experiences. Instead, test prep occupies classroom and planning time, where once teachers gathered to study student writing and math problem solving to craft teaching points together, we now are dedicating meetings every week perseverating over how we can move students a few percentage points on the PARCC and reviewing the most recent predictive standardized test data. Our students feel it even more acutely. This year during predictive assessments, computers shut down mid-test. Essays that were painstakingly typed finger by finger suddenly deleted. Last year in my 2nd grade class, trackpads on laptops proved difficult to use by 7-year-old fingers that tried to drag and drop a ruler to measure an apple on the screen. And then our children cried, and some even banged their heads against desks saying hurtful things about themselves. All of this for a test that provides only really a small snapshot of what our children can do. Teachers know that good teaching requires useful assessments that show us what our children can do and what we need to teach next. When I taught 2nd grade, I created an assessment in which I observed my 2nd graders use actual rulers and meter sticks, not one they had to drag across a computer screen, to measure the distance of a rolled toy car and to discuss their mathematical process and thinking. This revealed their process, not just their answer. And I could see when they left a gap between the ruler when iterating it, or looked at the wrong side and reported centimeters instead of inches, and I knew exactly what to teach next. This year, my 5th graders read research studies and newspaper and journal articles to research the benefits and consequences of serving chocolate milk in our schools' cafeterias, and they formed arguments, developed thesis statements, found evidence to support their reasons, and acknowledged and rebutted counter-arguments. They then organized this information to present in panel presentations, much like we're having here tonight, to our school administrators, the PTA, cafeteria staff, and central office nutrition team, buttoning up their school uniform shirts to the top collar and confidently making their case. These are the same students who a week before cried during standardized testing and beamed as they walked away from this assessment, patting each other on the back saying, "I had no idea we could do that. We sounded so smart." And they did. Using a rubric, I then evaluated their work against the Common Core standards and knew exactly what to do next to strengthen their argument writing. Creating rigorous, useful assessments like these that ask students to synthesize skills is the first step in our planning process as teachers. When we backwards plan, we ask, how will we know if our students can do this? And then what skills do we need to teach so they can do it? But when a computer-based test, like the PARCC, is the final assessment, we're in turn asked to teach the skills for that test. School accountability measures need to make room for assessments that provide useful information for parents and teachers to know how to best support their children. A PARCC score alone does not do this. Relying on PARCC as our primary measure of school success is the convenient choice. Creating useful and comprehensive assessments that truly measure a student's growth and achievement is challenging work, but that's essential to good teaching and good schools. I urge you to vote no to the proposed plan because it places too much weight on standardized testing, and it will leave little room for teachers to create useful assessments that will actually guide student learning. Thank you. Hi, my name is Jessie Papalia. I'm a resident of Ward 1 and a third grade teacher at Capital City Public Charter School in Ward 4. I want to start out by saying thank you to the State Board for listening and responding to public feedback on ESSA, and I'm here to request as well that you vote no on the OSSI proposal unless the weight of testing in schools is reduced. I think one thing we can all agree on is our end goal is a high quality education for every student in DC. Everyone, OSSI, the State Board, teachers, everyone agrees on that, family members. To me, the question is, how much do PARCC scores reveal about the quality of an education that the school is providing? How much does technological access and capability get tested by the PARCC? I teach the earliest grade that is tested by the PARCC, and therefore the youngest students who are assessed using standardized testing. For my students, the PARCC tests many things. The PARCC tests how quickly a student can type. It tests whether an 8-year-old has the stamina to complete more than a dozen complexly worded multi-step math problems in 60 minutes. It also tests whether a student knows how to use a touchpad, similar to Erin's experience, to drag and drop items. PARCC does not just test whether a student has mastered a standard. We have so many assessments that we do all of the time. We have school-based assessments. We have assessments used from really rigorous curriculum like Engage New York. We have assessments that are constantly being used, but they are not the PARCC. And yet when we look at PARCC scores, they're not aligning consistently. This is something teachers have found again and again. And I think the question really is PARCC an accurate measure of what a student knows? We know that if we base 80% of evaluation of a school on inaccurate data, we're gonna have a serious issue. If we base effectiveness of if we base it on inaccurate data, we will lose great teachers, and we already are. So I think my question for today really is about, do we know how accurate this data really is? And basing 80% of our school evaluation on something that perhaps is not aligning to what teachers are seeing every single day is a real concern for educators. And this is what I've heard from dozens of educators across schools. I am a part of a group of educators and community members in Ward 1, several of whom are here today, and we've been meeting to discuss this issue. I would like to invite any board member who would like the experience of taking a PARCC practice test and discussing it with us to join us for our next meeting on April 4th. We feel the experience of taking the test itself will help us, as well as anyone who join us, to become better informed citizens on this issue. Finally, in closing, I just want to say DC really must be and can be and should be a model for this country in choosing what is right and not what is easy. It is easy and quick to look solely at standardized testing to evaluate a school. It is much harder and more time-consuming to create a more accurate evaluation system that assesses the many factors that create a high-quality school. We really must ask ourselves if the PARCC does that, or at least contributes 80% of that evaluation. We owe it to the kids of this city to accurately evaluate their schools so we can ensure all students receive a high-quality education. Thank you.
Again, thank you, panel, for testifying. Are there any questions from board members? Mr. Wheaton?
I'd be remiss if I didn't ask Ms. Singh a couple of questions. My son, after the last hearing, found out you were here. Oh, she ran with me to the Capitol and back, and she pushed me so hard. So I'm going to push you a little bit. First, you talk a little bit about the amount of time that you spend on test prep. How much of your day with the students are the students spending on test prep?
Well, I think I would.
And I know it varies a little bit, but
I think depending on what the time of year, what we're doing, schools are giving, and I can only speak from my experience from working in 2 DC schools, but in many of the schools we're using predictive assessments throughout the year to see how our students will perform on PARCC. In DCPS, many DCPS schools use the ANET. Other schools use MAP, and I can't even, I'm like blinking on even more because I only teach ELA, but there are even more that they're using during math as well. We're giving those assessments at least like almost every 6 weeks. And so what we're doing is students are sitting down and taking a standardized test in math, in ELA, during these cycles. And then after the cycle, we are looking at the data, assessing the data, having planning meetings to plan intervention groups, planning reteach tests, reteach lessons based on the ANET data. Most recently, the one I gave wasn't aligned to the unit we had just finished. And so the ANET assessment that I gave was something I was teaching
in 6 weeks later. And so the assessment was something it was content we hadn't taught yet. And then I'm planning reteach lessons on an assessment for content that hasn't been taught yet.
Right.
And so time is going into looking at data for those predictive assessments a lot. And then this week I'm starting my writing park test prep for the assessment.
Right. And the reason I want to ask, I think we're in this debate about how do we get to the outcomes we want in policy versus practice. And I think what I've heard time and time from teachers is, and we heard it today, what's measured is what we do. So when we're measuring the testing, we put a lot of time towards those tests at the neglect of the other things that I truly believe helps kids to learn. And we do have to find a balance. I think the test is important. The PARCC test is important. We need to produce kids who are proficient. I'm over my time, but if one of my colleagues granted me a little bit of extra time, I'd love to get thoughts on how we can have project-based learning that is disaggregatable across demographics, and how we can ensure standards across the city so that something like that could truly be used in an accountability system. I'm not necessarily convinced it can be.
It has been, and there are standards that are aligned with project-based learning. They're applied learning standards. And of course, it requires multiple ways of measuring achievement. And of course, you've heard here repeatedly that students learn in multiple ways, but we are assessing what they learn in one way. So there are school districts that have successfully used standards and evaluation tools. Portfolio exhibitions is one example, but there are many that have been successfully used by school districts in other parts of the country. Seattle, Washington is one that comes to mind that has been doing it for years. It's just a matter of having the will to decide that we have more than one way of measuring student success.
And if I may, at the school I taught at previously, we used portfolio based assessments for our students for the entire school year that students presented at conferences at the end of the year. We also used teacher-created rubrics and school-based rubrics for assessing all of that. The math experience that I described was something that a committee of teachers worked on for over 3 years, developing those assessments to align with Common Core when we adopted the Common Core standards, to create tasks that were Common Core aligned, and we had a group of teachers from pre-K through 8th grade working on just the elementary assessments to create that. But that was then, those were assessments that weren't accepted under OSSI to be considered, and so that's when we had to then adopt assessments like the MAP in order to have a standardized assessment that was acceptable under the federal law.
So one change from the previous OSSI draft to this one is that the weight on testing did drop from 80% to, in effect, 74% in years 1 and 2, and then down to 70% in year 3. In years 1 and 2, all of the points that are taken away from testing are put towards attendance and re-enrollment. And in the final year, that's true, I think, of 5 points of them, if my arithmetic is right. One of the arguments that we heard all the way through this process and tonight was that one reason for dropping the weight on testing is to drop the weight on testing for all the reasons that people have discussed. The other reason to drop the weight is to make room for much richer, more appropriate, accurate assessments, metrics. And so my question, and it's really to anybody, to what extent do you think the increased weight on attendance and re-enrollment is a useful way of measuring school climate, which I know we're all interested in, and also whether or not it, whether it will whether it will help incentivize the schools in good directions, which is another purpose of our school accountability system. Anybody want to get that?
Sure, and I do appreciate having the reduction in the weight given to tests. However, giving that to attendance and enrollment, I do not consider that as the answer. I think that there are some other indicators that have not even been discussed here that we need to explore. The plan needs to look at some of the other school climate indicators that have been used that not only indicate achievement, but it also lends itself to helping schools determine where students are weak, where any part of a school's academic climate is weak, need assistance. And we've recommended to Superintendent Kang and to the Deputy Mayor Niles a school climate indicator that would dig much deeper than the superficial ones that some of the ones that I have reviewed that are basically Likert scales that don't give you a lot of information below the surface. But we have recommended a climate indicator that would allow students, parents, teachers, administrators, community support staff to weigh in on. And it actually, in analyzing the data that is collected from such indicators, it actually will help schools to determine what areas they need to improve in. But it will also identify other areas where students show achievement that we don't consider or measure. When, actually several people spoke ahead of me that talked about the importance of recognizing successes that teachers make with students and that students make who are not proficient, and how in the past, because our focus has been on the test score and proficiency, that we basically have ignored successes of students and teachers and schools, which has led to a lot of frustration, high teacher turnover, low morale, and student frustration, because it basically says to students and schools that even though you've moved on the scale, we don't care. It doesn't mean anything. It's not worth anything unless you're proficient. And one of you asked earlier about proficiency versus growth. Proficiency is unrealistic if we're looking at some of those issues that students come to school with. Issues around poverty, because poverty does matter. And we can't ignore that. School climate indicators that dig deeper than just what we're accustomed to seeing is important, and we need to explore what some of those are. Taking a look at other measures of success other than a PARCC test on a computer that most schools don't even have, which has basically frustrated students. Some of them are actually protesting by simply not caring. They purposely just come and bubble in any answer. Mm-hmm. So there's so many obstacles that get in the way of learning, the focus on testing and less focus on instruction.
Thank you, Ms.
I've taught for 40 years. And so I think that if teachers are allowed more time to teach the content and ways that students learn, we will see the successes that we're looking for.
Thank you.
I think that both those measures disproportionately impact schools with high churn, things that the teachers and the principals have no control over. In my testimony, I talked about behavior. I think that we have developed a school choice system that impacts parent behavior. And parents move kids around a lot more than they used to. And I don't think, re-enrollment's a good idea. When I first read re-enrollment, I was thinking in terms of schools which sort of harass kids out, like you should take care of the kids so they come back. But because we have so much school choice and because our parents don't invest in our schools because of that, even kids that are doing well where you don't have issues of mobility, people are moving kids from school to school. And so I don't think you should charge schools for that.
Thank you. Mr. Jacobson.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm going to take a little license here, and while I've appreciated every witness's testimony and I've listened very carefully, Ms. Livingston, you're such a terrific advocate for yourself and for this board, and I can't thank you enough. Even when we disagree, I find you very agreeable, so thank you for being here tonight and for being a part of this process, and thank you to all the witnesses. I wonder if the panel could very quickly in the next 90 seconds or so, we've talked about churn and teacher turnover. Is teacher retention an important accountability measure to see if a school is successful and accountable? And if each of you could just do a quick yes or no. I know this could be there's a lot of meat on this bone.
Yes,
but
there is.
but if we could be as brief as possible, I'd love to start on my left and just have everyone maybe 10 seconds.
Okay, in my testimony, I talked about the difference over the last 8 years between when my oldest entered the middle school and my youngest didn't. They happened to have attended a school that had historically had teachers that had been there a long time. And the performance of the school was degraded tremendously when they lost all the veteran teachers and then could not sustain the new teachers.
Thank you. Ms. Livingston?
Yes.
Thank you. Ms. Davis?
Yes, the instability that is created by teacher turnover, it wreaks havoc on students, especially a lot of the students that come to schools that are fragile and come from unstable communities. Instability in schools is something that absolutely does not work well for them.
Thank you. Ms. Thiesing?
Yes. And just to say that trusting relationships are at the center, I think, of a strong school culture and retaining both teachers and students, and that requires people being there.
Thank you. And Ms. Papilia?
Yes, definitely. And I think one of the things that isn't talked about as much is when new teachers, we talk a lot about how hard of a time it is, can be a first-year teacher and how hard that is. But when there are so many new teachers, the teachers who are not new have the bulk of the work on them. So not only does it put pressure on the new teachers who don't have a full idea of mastery of their profession yet, but it also puts so much pressure on the people who have been there, and that creates turnover both among veteran and short-term teachers in schools, really creating a toxic environment for retention.
Thank you all so much for coming and for being brief.
Thank you.
Aaron, I take it that you
All
don't
right.
want me to have it.
Sarah Stone, Erica Russell, Dana Hall, Allison Brown, Sheila Carr, Ann Almquist, Nancy Havendick, so you have us all to yourself. You begin when you...
Greetings, State Board of Education members and State Superintendent. My name is Allison Kreiner Brown. I'm the Associate Director of Teaching for Change, a DC-based nonprofit whose mission is building social justice starting in the classroom. I'm also a resident of Ward 7, a voter, and the parent of an incoming pre-K3 student. So Teaching for Change for the past 25 years has been working here in Washington, D.C. Our work involves directly supporting and engaging with educators, parents, and schools in all 8 wards. Additionally, our staff represents parents and voters in wards 1, 3, 4, 5, 7, and 8. As advocates for education, for equity in education, who recognize the damage that high-stakes standardized testing has inflicted on teaching and student learning, both locally and nationally, and as a member of the Coalition for DC Public Schools and Communities, I'm here to comment on the State Board's recommendations for the improvement of ESSA accountability and OSCE's revised accountability plan released March 14th. Noteworthy that it was one day ago. So I'm going to sort of frame this by commenting on several strengths of the State Board recommendations, which really we applaud and just showed an incredible amount of listening to the community and the concerns that have been echoed across all 8 wards. And that particularly those that are not addressed or not present in the revised accountability plan. First, we echo one of the State Board's comments that, quote, we are not satisfied with defining the measures of school accountability based on the measures that happen to exist now in the current plan. The shift from 80% dependence on PARCC scores to 70% for elementary and middle schools still places far too much emphasis on a single high-stakes standardized test that only assesses English language arts and math. At the high school level, the academic achievement measures are also narrowed and weighted too much. We do support the call to expand the weight of non-test factors in K through 8, at least if not immediately, at least within 2 to 3 years. Second, we deem the school environment measures inadequate and too heavily focused on attendance, which can be impacted by many factors outside of the school's control and is not necessarily indicative of the learning environment in the school. The weight of attendance is too high, and the access and opportunities, or i.e. the well-rounded education weight, is too low. The troubling absence of subjects outside of ELA and math in academic achievement and growth means that the school environment measures must incorporate these and other critical components of a well-rounded education. This must be addressed at all levels. Commitment toward a well-rounded education must be at the forefront of our discussions and decisions about how to nurture college, career-ready, and civic-minded young people in the District of Columbia. We cannot overstate that the revised weight of 70% PARCC, math, and ELA scores, even with the slight favoring of growth over proficiency, leaves inadequate room for a well-rounded education. Regarding the STAR rating system, we reject OSSI's conclusion to utilize one overall rating with a supplemented school report card. We are supposed to be moving away from the paradigm of good and bad schools, but the STAR rating will continue us on that track. As a parent who recently and painstakingly went through the school lottery process and a dozen open houses, I can tell you the single score does a true disservice to many schools and families. The current singular rankings that may seem to offer clarity on the OSSI DCPS and My School DC websites, in fact, do not. The ranking simply serves as an initial screening to many parents. Please respect that parents, students, and community members are capable of processing multiple ratings or dashboards and want that information up front. We support, with some reservation, namely for the need for clarity, the State Board's suggestion to replace PARCC scores with access growth scores for ELL students. The matter should be revisited by one or more of the task forces suggested by the State Board with heavy input from ELL educators. We also believe that insofar as possible under federal law, students with severe cognitive impediment should not be required to take the PARCC tests. Finally, with the absence of interim measures for desirable accountability indicators that are not yet available, namely comprehensive school environment assessments, high school growth measures, and an index or indicators of well-rounded education, it is imperative that, and you all will have copies, I emailed them, and there are print copies of this. So one, in the final ESSA accountability plan, OSSI incorporates the State Board's recommendations to establish a task force to explore these measures not yet available. Two, OSSI establishes an additional task force to study the implementation and effects of testing in DC schools as suggested by the State Board, including impacts on and options for ELL students. And three, OSSI establishes clear and public deadlines for reports on progress towards not yet available measures, drafts to be made available, an adequate time for public input, finally, dates for piloting and or initial implementation. My last comment, I will modify a line from the State Board's recommendations. If simulations indicate that the rating of individual schools does not change by virtue of this new accountability plan, it nonetheless makes sense to ensure that every school will be held accountable to providing each student in the district with a well-rounded education. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you. Any questions from board members? Dr. Woodruff, Mr. Whedon, Ms. Carter, Ms. Wattenberg.
I'm just going to say thank you very, very much.
Mr. Jacobson. And thank you very much for your testimony. Seeing no further questions from this panel, you're excused. And seeing no further witnesses on our list, I want to thank all of our witnesses tonight for their input and for their patience during this lengthy hearing. And we have a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
Meeting adjourned.